Every time the Beatles release an LP or a single, the pop music business usually changes direction. The changes instigated by their latest contribution, Abbey Road, will most certainly be noticed.
1969 was a great time for Beatles fans all over the world. At the start of the year, people were still enjoying the huge Wight album. The animated movie Yellow Submarine was still playing in theaters in January, and it had been a big hit. That same month, the movie soundtrack album came out. It went gold fast and had 4 new Beatles songs that fans hadn't heard before. Then in April, TV Guide ran an article called 4 Cats on a London Roof, which got many fans excited. The article talked about a Beatles TV documentary that was being made. It said that it would show people around the world just how the Beatles go about their work. Not long after that, a brand new single came out for spring, Get Back. Like Lady Madonna from the year before, it was a big hit. It went straight to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 charts and stayed there for 5 weeks. Just a few weeks later, they released another song, The Ballad of John and Yoko. Even though Get Back was still number 1, and some radio stations wouldn't play the new song because of the lyrics, it still made the top 10. Fans who wanted to know more about the Beatles were also getting to read Hunter Davies' official biography, The Beatles, which was released in September of 1968. A lot of fans were still reading it in early '69, including this quote from Paul. "All of us always appear to be changing, just because we don't conform. It's this not conforming, wanting to do something different all the time, that keeps our music different." But behind the scenes, things weren't going so well. The Beatles were fighting a lot. Paul wanted to make a new album fast, in just a month, instead of the usual 5 months it took before. And they filmed the whole thing for a TV show, but the project didn't turn out well and got shelved. That made the fighting worse. They were also dealing with money and legal problems. 3 of the Beatles were feeling done with the band. John was focusing on his new life with Yoko and didn't really care much about the band anymore. Fans still wanted music, but it seemed like the Beatles didn't. Then something surprising happened from inside the group, something that saved everything. George explained what happened in Anthology.
Well, I think the deal was that, through Let It Be, it was like I left, and we got back on the basis that we've got to just finish it up, make it tidy. So I got back on that basis. Then everybody decided, well, we ought to do one better album.
Paul adds, "It was like, we should put down the boxing gloves and try and just get it together and really make a very special album." George Martin said,
Let It Be was such an unhappy record, really, even though there's some great songs on it. I really thought that was the end of the Beatles, and I thought that I would never work with them again. I thought, what a shame to go out there like this. So I was quite surprised when Paul rang me up and said, "We're going to make another record. Would you like to produce it?" And my immediate answer was, "Only if you let me produce it the way we used to." And he said, we do want to do that. I said, "John included?" He said, "Yes, honestly." So I said, "Well, if you really want to do that, let's do it, and let's get together again."
Meanwhile, Jeff Emerick was busy setting up the Beatles' new Apple studio when he got a call from Paul. "Hello, Jeff. How are you getting on?" he asked me breezily. "Fine," I told him. "I'm just trying to sort out some of these studio costings." Naturally enough, I assumed that was the reason for his call, but I was wrong. "Never mind that, Jeff. There's something more important I need to talk to you about. We're going back into EMI this summer to record a new album, and we want you to engineer it." Jeff said right away, "Yeah, brilliant." Then he added, we chatted some more, and I asked Paul as diplomatically as I could if everyone was getting along these days. "Yes, things are pretty good," he replied. "We sorted a lot of our problems out, and there's going to be a better vibe in the studio this time around. We're planning on doing this album the way we used to make records, with George really producing." It sounded almost too good to be true, but I kept my skepticism to myself. Come what may, I'd be engineering another Beatles album after all.
I remember doing Let It Be. We sat in Apple around the table, and I come up with this idea, that we should. I often had an idea. Could be anyone who had the idea, but it happened to be me that Let It Be. I said, it'd be good, if we're going to go on a film and so on. I remember John said, why? What for? I kind of explained a bit more. He said, oh, I get it. You want a job? Yeah, that's it. And it was like, oh, he wants a job. And it was like, it seemed strange to me that they didn't. But they all seemed quite happy just sort of sitting out in St. George's Hill, just languishing. I always wanted to make the group great and even greater. And when we made Let It Be, and it was a bit crummy, I insisted that we made Abbey Road. Because I knew what we were capable of, and I didn't think we pulled it off in that Let It Be. And then with the Phil Spector remix, we kind of walked away from that LP. We didn't really want to know. In fact, the best version of it was before anyone got hold of it. The Glyn Johns' early mixes were great, but they were very bare, very Spartan album, but it's great. Now it'd be one of the hippest albums going if they brought it. It's probably on bootlegs. Yeah, but before it got its overdubs, before it had all its raw edges off it, that was like one of the best Beatles albums, because it was a bit kind of avant-garde, really, because it was just purely as we recorded it down there in Apple or on the roof. It was that, with a good sound on it from Glyn Johns, just a couple of mics over the drums, and very basic, because he's a basic project. And I loved it.
One of the Beatles' biggest strengths was their lyrics. John and Paul in particular got very good at telling relatable stories, often in songs that were only 3 minutes long. In 1969, John tried something new, using very few words to express very strong emotions. He showed this with I Want You, She's So Heavy, a song nearly 8 minutes long, the longest actual song the Beatles ever recorded. Only Revolution 9 is longer, but that's more of a sound collage. In this track, John conveys his deep feelings for Yoko Ono using just 15 different words, most of which are repeated. I want you so badly, it's driving me mad. She's so heavy. What makes I Want You, She's So Heavy stand out is how powerful it is despite the minimal lyrics. No more words were needed. And the meaning was clear to listeners. As Ian MacDonald wrote in Revolution in the Head, Lennon's passion for Ono had shaken him to the core. Lennon is literally obsessed. You can hear John's feelings for Yoko in some of his earlier White Album songs, like Julia, Happiness is a Warm Gun, and I'm So Tired. But by early '69, his focus on their relationship had grown so intense that it became his main songwriting subject. In Don't Let Me Down, he pleads with her to stay. In Dig a Pony, the chorus says clearly, all I want is you. John introduced I Want To at the end of the Get Back sessions in January of 1969, but it became the unofficial beginning of Abbey Road. Musically, the verses of the song are similar to Mel Torme's 1962 song, Comin' Home Baby, which was a big hit in the UK.
I'm coming home, baby, now. I'm coming home now, right away.
John also said Yoko influenced his songwriting style.
I Want You, Seashell.
Oh, well, you know what that's me about Yoko.
Yeah, it's a great guitar thing again.
Well, that's my guitar bit.
Yeah.
The whole thing, lick, piece, playing, I play the whole parts throughout the guitar.
The ending too? Because that sounds
Yes, that's my lick.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's lots of guitar parts that are written by me and played by me in Beatle records. They just never were written.
The first day we were talking, you were belittling your guitar. It sounds like you shouldn't be.
Well, you know, I'm sort of I can't play as well as other people play, but I have a style. My spirit comes through when I play guitar, but I'm a limited guitar player in respect of notes and being very fast and things like that. You know, I have a style of playing which I can always do. I just never took it any further because I was more interested. While I was writing songs, George was learning guitar. I was a singer, and that's why his singing took a long time to get good, and his songwriting, because he was concentrating on guitar. I concentrated on performing and writing songs.
George praised the song in '69, saying,
It gets sort of, it is very heavy. It's really basically a bit like a blues. John has an amazing thing with his timing. he always comes across with sort of different time in things. Like, example, all you need is love. Nothing you can do that can't be done. Dun, 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 a song, which just sort of skips beats out and changes from 3, 4, 4, 4, you know, all in and out of each other. But when you question him as to what it is, he doesn't know. He just does it naturally. And once you try and pin it down, you know, the bridge section of this is a bit like that. It's got a really very good chord sequence that he uses.
Engineer Jeff Jarrett remembers, John and George went into the far left-hand corner of number 2 to overdub those guitars. They wanted a massive sound. I was getting a bit of pickup, so I asked George to turn it down a little. He looked at me and said, dryly, "You don't talk to a Beatle like that." Damn, George. Jeff Emmerich says, George set up the Moog synthesizer. Yes. Moog is pronounced Moog. George set up the Moog synthesizer at John's request and twiddled the knobs as the great behemoth spit out white noise, tacked onto the end of I Want You, She's So Heavy. The Moog synthesizer was an early analog electronic instrument created by the American engineer Robert Moog in the 1960s. One of the first commercially available synthesizers, and it played a major role in shaping modern electronic music. John said, "It's pretty heavy at the ending, you know, because we used the Moog synthesizers on it, and the range of the sound is from minus whatever to way over. Well, you can't hear it. That instrument, the Moog synthesizer, can do all the sounds, you know, all ranges of sounds. And we did that on the end. If you're a dog, you can hear a lot more." And then there was the matter of how the song would end, Emmerich continues. When they recorded the backing track, the Beatles had just played on and on, with no definitive conclusion, so I assumed that they would be doing a fade-out. John had other ideas, though. He let the tape play until just 20 seconds or so before the take broke down, and then all of a sudden he barked out an order. "Cut the tape here." "Cut the tape?" I asked, astonished. We had never ended a song that way. And an abrupt ending like that didn't make any sense unless the track was going to run directly into another one. But that wasn't the case here, because it had already been decided that I Want You would close side 1 of the album. My protestations had no impact on John. His decision was absolute. "You heard what I said, Jeff. Cut the tape." I glanced over at George Martin, who simply shrugged his shoulders. So I got out the scissors and sliced the tape at precisely the point John indicated. And that's the way side 1 of Abbey Road ends. At the time, I thought he was out of his mind, but due to the shock factor, it ended up being incredibly effective, a Lennon concept that really worked. John was so enamored of the white noise that George had overdubbed with his Moog synthesizer that he actually had Ringo supplement it by spinning the wind machine secreted in Studio 2 percussion cupboard. As we sat in the control room mixing the track, he started becoming almost obsessed with the sound. "Louder! Louder!" he kept imploring me. "I want the track to build and build and build, he explained. And then I want the white noise to completely take over and blot out the music altogether. I looked over at John as though he were crazy, but he paid me no mind. Over one shoulder, I could see Yoko smiling a taut little smile, her tiny teeth gleaming in the light. Over the other, I could see a dejected Paul, sitting slumped over, head down, staring at the floor. He didn't say a word, but his body language made it clear that he was very unhappy, not only with the song itself, but with the idea that the music, the Beatles' music, which he considered almost sacred, was being obliterated with noise. In the past, he would have said something, perhaps just a diplomatic, "Don't you think that's a bit too much, John?" But now Paul seemed too beaten down to argue the point with a gleeful Lennon, who seemed to be taking an almost perverse pleasure at his bandmates' obvious discomfort. To Paul, it must have been like Revolution 9 all over again. John was deliberately distorting Beatles music, trying to turn the group into an avant-garde ensemble instead of a pop band. I looked around the room. Ringo and George seemed to be into what John was doing. They had their eyes closed and were swaying to the beat. It was just Paul looking miserable, staring down at the floor. His isolation from the others never seemed more apparent.
I think everyone was getting a little tired of us by then, because we were taking a long time and there was many discussions going on by then, many heated discussions.
Billy Preston was a great help. He was a very good keyboard guy, and his work on Get Back alone justified him being there. And he was an amiable fellow too, very nice. And he was a kind of emollient, if you like. He helped to lubricate the friction that had been there.
It's interesting to see how people behave nicely when you bring a guest in, because they don't really want everybody to know that they're so bitchy. And this happened back in the Wight album, when I brought Eric Clapton in to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Suddenly everybody's on their best behavior. So I put a message out to find if Billy was in town and told him to come in to Savile Row, which he did. Straight away it just became 100% improvement in the vibe in the room. And everybody was happier also to have somebody else playing in the band.
On his 26th birthday, George dropped by EMI Studios to lay down a quick demo of All Things Must Pass. Just him on the guitar, real simple stuff. The previous November, he'd spent some time at the Big Pink, the Woodstock home studio where Bob Dylan and the band had been holed up since late '66, and you can really hear their influence just all over the song. It's one of George's most thoughtful tracks, and he actually brought it to the table during the Get Back sessions.
See that a mine can blow those clouds away. Looks like it. Social comment like.
It looks like it on the paper.
A miner can blow these clouds away.
Writing.
What do they all have?
All Things Must Pass was me trying to do a Robbie Robertson band sort of tune, and that is what it turned into, George said. It was written after the Beatles' trip to India. I wrote it at home in England, maybe in 1968. It was just a little song I wrote in the garden with one of Dylan's big, old, gray National guitars. All Things Must Pass has sort of turned out to be quite prophetic. It's a song about the impermanence of everything. Even the best of times, or the worst times, they all pass. While rehearsing All Things Must Pass at Twickenham, John doesn't say much directly about the song, but he seems open and cooperative, at least during the early run-throughs. He plays along on guitar, and there isn't much sign of open resistance, though it becomes obvious that the song isn't getting the full Lennon-McCartney treatment. George has got a few songs we didn't even bother to work on, like All Things Must Pass. He's got a lot of stuff. This is probably the closest John ever came to acknowledging All Things Must Pass directly, and it's pretty telling. He admits that they just didn't give any attention to some of George's material, despite liking it. Paul, always the diplomat, had this to say. I think All Things Must Pass is a lovely song. I think that if we had all stuck together and not split, we could have worked on those songs more. I think that All Things Must Pass was a very good album. It was probably the right time for George to do that solo album. He had a lot to say, and I thought it was a good album. The songs were strong. To be fair, the Beatles did give the track a shot, and their version isn't too far off what George eventually recorded solo. Except they tried having John and Paul sing backing vocals on the chorus, which George later dropped, probably for the better. For whatever reason, they never quite finished it. One theory is that since George already had stronger contenders like Here Comes the Sun and Something, he may have held All Things Must Pass back for a later moment, one where he'd finally have the space to give it the attention it deserved.
But I always found it interesting the fact that it seemed too much like coincidence to me, the fact he got married, a month after you know what I mean?
Yeah, I think it was, we spurred each other into marriage. I mean, they were very strong together, which left me out of the picture. So I got together with Linda, and then we got strong, got our own kind of strength. And I used to listen to a lot of what they said. I remember him saying to me, "You've got to work at marriage," which is something I still remember as a bit of advice. I still remember that. And then, I think again, they were probably a little bit sort of peeved that we got married first. Probably a little way, just minor jealousies. And then so they got married.
But I wondered if
I don't know. Who knows? I'm making it up anyway.
I wondered if there was that thing, like you have two blokes who are like good mates.
Yeah.
And then, one of them finds a girl and the other, maybe the other one doesn't, whatever. There's like a lot of kind of, the friendship often breaks up, There's quite a lot of bitterness and acrimony.
Wedding Bells.
It seemed like one of them.
Wedding Bells is what it was. The song, the Wedding Bells are breaking up that old gang of mine.
Sure, yeah.
And we used to know that song. Gene Vincent did it. And we used to sing it. Oh, the gangs are on the come. They forgot Sweet Adeline. And we used to know that song. So the association we had when we were young was Army. It was sort of Army song. Where, Army buddies and Wedding Bells are breaking up this Army. But for us, the Army became the Beatles. So we always kind of knew that one day Wedding Bells would come true. And that was when it did.
We wanted to get married on the cross-channel ferry. That was the romantic part, when we went to Southampton, and then we couldn't get on because she wasn't English and she couldn't get that day visa to go across, and they said, anyway, you can't get married, the captain's not allowed to do it anymore. So we were in Paris and we were calling Peter Brown and said, we want to get married, where can we go? And he called back and said, Gibraltar's the only place. So, okay, let's go. And we went there. It was beautiful.
There was a gap of more than 8 months between Beatles singles. Hey Jude was released in late August of '68, while Get Back came out in April of '69. Fans, who were used to more frequent releases, were likely surprised when, just a month after Get Back, they released another new single, which was pretty unusual. So how did this second single come about so quickly? It started with an unexpected visit from John to Paul's home on April 14th. Usually it was the other way around. The newlyweds, John and Yoko, or Joko, came with a new song that they wanted help finishing. John was in an impatient mood, so I was happy to help, Paul said. He knew he could always leave a couple of sentences out, come and see me, and we knew we would always finish them. It was a guaranteed solution. Paul wrote the lyrics in his notebook that day, and in the track-by-track section of the Abbey Road 50th Anniversary book, the original title is shown as They're Going to Crucify Me. Barry Miles added, they quickly finished it off and went straight round to Abbey Road to record it. John wanted the Ballad of John and Yoko out fast, like a piece of musical journalism. The two remaining Beatles called George Martin and a few engineers to record the song right away, as John wanted the single out quickly, much as he would later do with Instant Karma. It's something I wrote, John said. It's like an old-time ballad. It's just the story of us getting married, going to Paris, going to Amsterdam, all that. It's Johnny B. Paperback Writer. John humorously compares the song to classic narrative rock songs like Chuck Berry's Johnny B. Good and the Beatles' own Paperback Writer. One other source of inspiration, intentional or not, seems to be Elvis's Don't Be Cruel. In the lyrics, John describes the difficulties he and Yoko have had to face trying to get married quickly and quietly. They first planned to marry on a cross-channel ferry, but were stopped because Yoko wasn't British and couldn't get a day visa. Frustrated, they flew to Paris. As you do. John had arranged a private jet, hoping they could marry there. They spent time down by the Seine, trying to organize a quiet wedding, but again, it wasn't possible. Not even John Lennon could get past the red tape. From Paris, they called Peter Brown and asked, "We want to get married. Where can we go?" He called back later and said, "Gibraltar's the only place." And that's where they finally got married. Actually, Paul originally wrote the line as, "You can marry in Gibraltar in Spain," but John sang it as "near Spain" in the final version. Calling Gibraltar part of Spain may have gotten them cancelled due to political disputes at the time, so the change likely avoided the song getting banned, as many Beatles songs were from '67 onwards. Why was Gibraltar the only option? I think John and Yoko were trying to keep the wedding fairly quiet. That's why they went to Gibraltar, Ringo said. Steve Turner added in A Hard Day's Right that Gibraltar was chosen because John, a British citizen, could get married there without much notice, unlike in France. Also, John had been traveling without a passport. You know, like you do? Maybe this was a pre-9/11 thing. They spent their honeymoon in Amsterdam, talking in their beds for a week, and that's when the idea for the infamous bed-ins came. Yoko and I decided that we knew that whatever we did was going to be in the papers anyway, John said in '75. We decided to utilize the space we would occupy anyway by getting married with a commercial for peace. Now the bed-in was just to catch the attention of the press. We sent out a card, "Come to John and Yoko's honeymoon, a bed-in, Amsterdam hotel." You should have seen the faces on those reporters. We said, let's get some peace, 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 peace on the headlines, just for a change. With that, you could say John and Yoko helped usher in the era of celebrities as political activists, not just as actors, musicians, or entertainers. This shift still continues today. Before them, celebrities weren't generally expected to be political. People like Elvis, Walt Disney, and James Dean largely wanted to avoid being seen as overtly political or being publicly affiliated with their political views. Of course, they weren't the first to be outspoken. I mean, Charlie Chaplin, Marlon Brando, and Paul Robeson were early examples of very political celebrities. But John and Yoko brought something new, a unique mix of art, media spectacle, and activism. They became impossible to ignore. Ever since the "we're more popular than Jesus" fiasco in '66, the world was never the same, and celebrity opinions had become more visible and more influential than ever before. We were asked to make a film for Austrian TV, John said. So when we went to Austria to show it, we did a press conference in a bag. They were saying, "Why us?" and "What is this?" And I said, "It's total communication." He explained that if everyone had to do job interviews in a bag, they'd be judged only by their inner qualities. They all had a very serious conversation with the bag, John said. Afterward, Austrian newspapers published photos of the press talking to the bag. People began to say that Yoko had changed John, which is referenced in the line, "She's gone to his head." By April, they were back in London. The fifth verse shows how, despite everything, they were warmly welcomed. The lyric, 50 acorns tied in a sack, refers to a peace campaign where they sent acorns to world leaders, asking them to plant trees for peace. The chorus compares their struggles to those of Jesus upon the cross. And you could already smell the controversy. John anticipated this, as shown by a note he sent to Apple's promo team. "No pre-publicity. Especially the Christ bit, so don't play it around too much or you'll frighten people. Get it pressed first. Paul remembered the day clearly. John said, I've got this song about me and Yoko, and I'm hot to record it. You could play bass, and you could play drums. He enlisted me. He wasn't at all sheepish about asking. I probably said, yeah, why not? In the end, I think playing on that session contributed to our having quite a few friendly meetings and conversations later. Geoff Emerick hadn't worked with them since quitting during the Wight album, and this track marked his return. I received a phone call from Peter Brown, Emerick says. Would I be willing to do the session? He specifically asked me if I could get you to engineer it. How could I possibly say no to that? Tensions had been running high between John and Paul in recent months due to disagreements over who should manage the band's affairs. John, George, and Ringo preferred Ellen Klein, and Paul preferred the law firm Eastman & Eastman, run by his new in-laws. Despite this division, John's excitement for a spontaneous new project rubbed off on Paul, the two of them now determined to tackle this undertaking on a day where they had nothing better to do anyway. They may as well make it a productive day off. Geoff Emerick remembers, to my amazement, a chipper John actually rolled up spot on time, with Paul following just a few minutes later. The two Beatles seemed remarkably relaxed, despite the horror stories I had heard about the rows and the bad feelings engendered by the Get Back sessions. On this one day, they reverted to being two old school chums, and all the nastiness of recent months swept under the rug and replaced by the sheer joy of making music together. It was a great session. One of those magic times when everything went right and nothing went wrong. A new 8-track machine had been installed in the control room just recently, and we put it to good use that day. The 8-track recorder allowed for lots of overdubs, so John played all of the guitars, both lead and rhythm, while Paul handled bass, piano, percussion, and drums. They made for a great two-man band. That was one of the first times I put microphones both on top and under the snare drum, which imparted a larger-than-life crack to the sound, the perfect complement to John's aggressive vocal. The whole record was completed in just a few hours, from start to finish, including the mix, just like the good old days. In just a few hours, they created 5 stereo mixes, choosing the 5th as the final version. It became the first Beatles single to release in stereo in the UK. No mono mix was made, another first for the Beatles.
And they chose Paul's wedding day to bust me on.
Really? Oh, because George was in my office, and Patty rang saying that Sergeant Pilcher, that was his name, right, was swarming all over the house at in Esher. And George said to me, well, what should I do? You know, what should I tell Patty? We had this conversation. And I said, well, have you got this stuff? They'll just tell them where it is, George, because they'll find it anyway. You know, save yourself a lot of hassles, you know. And he said, well, he had a bit of grass, maybe a bit of hash in a box on the mantelpiece, right?
You know, Sergeant Pilcher was gaining great notoriety of just busting pop stars, you know, besides George and Mick and Keith and John, and always was the same cop. Nobody realized, you know, nobody put 2 and 2 together.
What happened was there was the kind of social or pecking order that was in the pop world, And the drug squad decided to go around. I mean, this fella thought he was Oliver Cromwell, so he decided to go around and clean up what was going on. And they busted Donovan first. You know, anybody who was in England at that time will remember they bust Donovan, and then they bust the Rolling Stones, and they worked their way up, and then they busted John and Yoko and me.
Some say George started writing Old Brown Shoe as early as November of '68, around the making of the White Album, but he finished it in January 1969 at the end of the Get Back sessions. On January 27th, he showed up at Apple Studios and showed the others his brand new song. "I went to bed really late," he told them. "Wrote a good one. It's different, exciting, upbeat, and a rocker. I didn't even eat breakfast. I was going to go to bed, but then I heard John's voice in my head from years ago saying, 'Finish songs as soon as you start them.' So I did." John laughed and replied, "Yeah, I say that, but I never do it." As with a lot of his songs, George didn't have the title right away. That had been a habit of his since at least 1966. For the rhythm of Old Brown Shoe, he borrowed the feel of Bob Dylan's Highway 61 Revisited, which has a ska-like bounce to it. The Beatles had messed with ska rhythms before. Think I Call Your Name or Obla-di-Obla-da. But this time George leaned into it even more. Lyrically, it's a mix of love and sarcasm, with some of George's spiritual thinking underneath. He said it started as a play on opposites. Right, wrong, short, long, pick me up, drag me down, which tied into his Eastern beliefs. Some people compare the song to Paul's Hello Goodbye, but George was going deeper. Music writer Steve Turner pointed out that George saw the physical world as an illusion, so lines like "stepping out of this old brown shoe" could be about moving beyond that and getting closer to spiritual truth. He even sings, "I'm changing faster than the weather." The band rehearsed the song during the final days of January, just before the rooftop concert, but didn't record it properly right away. They wanted to take their time and get it right, and that ended up being a good call. A few months later, they finally nailed it in the studio with some overdubs, something they were trying to avoid during the Get Back sessions, but in this case, it paid off. George started by recording piano and vocals, then added rhythm guitar using low strings and that cool, choppy riff that ended up in the bridge. He also played a lead guitar part in the instrumental section and again at the end. This demo version, later heard on Anthology 3, gave a clear idea of how he wanted it to sound. You can imagine how great it would have been with Ringo on drums and the others on backing vocals. Jump to April 16th. The band finally laid down the rhythm track. They did 4 takes, with Ringo on drums, George singing and playing a jangly upright piano, called a jangle box, and Paul on electric guitar. George added that the piano had an old-school percussive sound, something used by artists like Russ Conway in the 1950s. Some say John played piano, but others say he played rhythm guitar. It's unclear if he was there for the early takes at all, but he likely joined in later. Paul's guitar part was pretty cool. In each verse, he played a riff for the first half, then switched to heavy rhythm playing. During the bridges, he played George's up and down riff from the demo, likely taught to him by George. On earlier takes, he switched back to rhythm at the end, but by the final version, take 4, they kept the riff all the way through. George later overdubbed his main guitar riffs, and Paul added bass, using a Fender Jazz bass and copying the same riff he'd played on the guitar earlier. when a Cream magazine interviewer in 1987 said the bass sounded like McCartney going nuts, George replied, "That was me going nuts, doing what I always do on guitar," pointing out that Paul was just mimicking his demo.
The idea being that originally we were gonna rehearse all these new songs and then make an album in a live show. Never really happened because the album became us in the studio. As we rehearsed the songs, they were recorded.
They were talking about doing a concert on a boat or a concert in an amphitheatre in Greece or, maybe at the Roundhouse in London. There was lots of different ideas about where they should maybe do a concert. And nothing was ever really agreed.
In fact, what happened was when we got in there, we showed how the breakup of a group works. We didn't realise that we were actually sort of breaking up, as it was happening.
Just the same as it was before, the year before, when we were last in the studio. There was a lot of kind of trivia and games that were being played.
Well, I think it shows as an absolute fact that we were going different places, I've mentioned it before, the energy for the Beatles was waning. We put in 1,000%, and then it was dwindling now. It's like, oh dear, do we have to turn up? We have to do that thing again? I want to do this, and John wants to do that, and, George was off. And
Something is a song of mine I wrote towards the end of the Beatles album, the Wight album. I wrote it as we were still recording that album, but I never finished it off. I could never think of words for it. And also because there was a James Taylor song called Something in the Way She Moves, which is the first line of that. And so then I thought of trying to change the words, but they were the words that came when I first wrote it. So in the end I just left it as that and just called it Something. And actually I think Joe Cocker's recorded this song.
Oh, yeah.
Because when I wrote it, I imagined somebody like Ray Charles doing it. It's, that's how the feel I imagined, but because I'm not Ray Charles, then, I'm sort of much more limited in what I can do. Then it came out like this. It's nice. It's probably the nicest melody tune that I've written.
Of the Beatles' career, it was easy to spot a Harris song on each album. Sure, these tracks added value to the records, but they were seen more as fillers than on equal footing with Lennon-McCartney work. I think the trouble with George was that he was never treated on the same level as having the same quality of songwriting by anyone, by John, by Paul, or by me. George Martin once admitted, "I'm as guilty in that respect. I was the guy who used to say, if he's got a song, we'll let him have it on the album," very condescendingly. I know he must have felt really bad about that. Gradually, he kept persevering, and his songs did get better, until eventually they got extremely good. Something is a wonderful song, but we didn't give him credit for it, and we never really thought he's going to be a great songwriter. George clearly felt overlooked. During an Apple meeting in the autumn of '69, recorded by Anthony Fawcett, he told the others, "Maybe now I just don't care whether you're going to like him or not. I just do him." And you know what? He was right. George remembers. Something was written on the piano while we were making the Wight album. I had a break while Paul was doing some overdubbing, so I went into an empty studio and began to write. That's really all there is to it, except the middle took some time to sort out. It didn't go on the Wight album because we'd already finished all the tracks. George later admitted that the "something in the way she moves" line came from a song by James Taylor. I could never think of words for it. There was a James Taylor song called "Something in the Way She Moves," which is the first line of that. And so then I thought of trying to change the words, but they were the words that came out when I first wrote it. So in the end I just left it as that and just called it Something. Taylor didn't mind George nicking this one line. I don't think he intentionally ripped anything off, and all music is borrowed from other music. So completely, I let it pass. If George either consciously or unconsciously took a line from one of my songs, then I find it very flattering, he said. But after coming up with the opening lines, George still struggled to complete the song. I usually get the first few lines of lyrics and melody both at once, and then I finish the melody usually first and then have to write the words. I wrote the whole first verse and just said everything I wanted to say, and so now I need to write a couple more verses. I find that much more difficult. But John gave me a handy tip once, which is, once you start to write a song, try and finish it straight away while you're in the mood. And I've learned from experience, because you go back to it, and then you're in a whole different state of mind, and it's more difficult. Sometimes it's easier, but on the whole, it's more difficult to come back to something, so I now try to finish some straight away. And just like Paul with Yesterday, George found something came to him surprisingly easy, making him doubt whether he had unconsciously just copied it from somewhere else. Can you believe that? George then showed the song to the others on January 28, 1969, during the Get Back sessions, and John began to encourage him. Let's pick up on the ones that are all in pieces. I'm trying to get us to do one of George's for the first batch, you know. You can see in his eyes that John is sniffing some real gold in George's idea, but he struggled with the lyrics. What could it be, Paul? Something in the way she moves, something like that. Attracts me like. I couldn't think of what attracted me at all, John jokingly suggested. Just say whatever comes into your head each time. Attracts me like a cauliflower. Until you get the word. George replied, but I've been through this one for about 6 months. I mean, just that line. Attracts me like a pomegranate. We could have that. After this, something was put aside for a while. After Get Back, the Beatles were sort of in a state of uncertainty, with legal issues and personal tensions among them. On February 25th, as we mentioned previously, George recorded demos of 3 songs at EMI Studios on his 26th birthday. By mid-April, despite ongoing business conflicts, John and Paul cranked out the new song, The Ballad of John and Yoko. Inspired by this, George brought the band together again on April 16th to begin working on 2 of his February demos, Old Brown Shoe and Something. Paul says, George comes in, shows us the song. That would just be with a guitar and all just round a couple of chairs around a little circle, and it was all fairly instant, you know. It was just, we gotta do this song, we gotta do it, and let's just try it every which way until we settle on, oh yeah, this feels good. And what a good idea it proved to be. Jeff Emmerich remembers, George was clearly still holding a grudge against Paul, and it seemed that he got some degree of revenge during the recording of Something. I couldn't help but notice that George was actually giving Paul direction on how to play the bass, telling him repeatedly that he wanted the part greatly simplified. It was a first in all of my years of working with the Beatles. George had never dared tell Paul what to do. He'd simply never asserted himself that way. Paul confirms this in the Beatles anthology. I think George thought my bass playing was a little bit busy. Again, from my side, I was trying to contribute the best I could, but maybe it was his turn to tell me that I was too busy. But that was fun. That went off well. In McCartney 321, Paul adds, "It's very tempting when you're on the bass, and I probably start simple, then you might find that bit that we were kind of liking. It's a nice little melody. It's pretty adventurous. I did get sort of reprimanded once or twice about being too busy, but by that time I heard Motown bassist James Jamerson. He was great. He had melodic bass lines, and I loved that. I kind of opened my eyes to it. It was like, yeah, wow, A groove. Make it move, yeah? You can actually control the band with the bass. Emmerich said, George was once again very nervous when it came time to do the vocal. No matter what we did to create a vibe, turning the lights down low, lighting incense, he just couldn't get comfortable. It was a difficult song to sing, but in the end he did a magnificent job. It was interesting. George never seemed to get cold feet doing backing vocals, but whenever he had to do a lead vocal, he'd lose his confidence. The only hitch came when George announced that he wanted to redo the guitar solo on something. We were perfectly willing to accommodate him, but the problem was that there was only one track available, and we needed to use that for the orchestra. The only solution was for him to play it live, right along with the orchestra, so that we could record them simultaneously on the same track. I was enormously impressed when he nonchalantly said, "Okay, let's do that." It took a lot of nerve and self-confidence to be willing to put himself under that kind of pressure. George had to play the solo correctly all the way through, without punch-ins, because the sound coming from the guitar amp would leak onto the other mics, and he couldn't get a lot of wax at it because it was costing quite a lot to have that orchestra there. But he managed to play the intricate solo with ease, and by the end of the long night, both of his songs were completed and ready to be mixed. By the end of the Beatles' time together, the improvement in George's songwriting had caught many people off guard. I met Michael Jackson somewhere at the BBC. The fellow interviewing us made a comment about something, and Michael said, "Oh, you wrote that? I thought it was a Lennon McCartney." Listeners who checked the label and saw George Harrison as the songwriter were usually surprised, but in a good way. Recognition for something grew quickly, and it eventually became the second most covered Beatles song, and, for many, one of the best Beatles songs.
Oh, Darling was a great one of Paul's that she didn't sing too well. Yeah. You know, I always thought I could have done it better. It was more my style than his, but he wrote it, so what the hell, he's going to sing it. But if he'd had any sense, he should have let me sing it.
John and Paul's passion for rock and roll, the genre that first inspired them, remains strong. This influence, of course, appeared in many of their later songs, reflecting the straightforward styles of Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, and Buddy Holly. They frequently returned to these musical roots, even if only briefly. In early '69, Paul fully embraced nostalgia with "Oh Darling." The title itself echoed the 50s, complete with an added exclamation point for emphasis. Paul began writing "Oh Darling" as early as December 1968, shortly after the release of the Wight album. He ran through the song on piano on January 3, 1969, the second day of rehearsals for the Get Back sessions. It's believed that "Oh Darling" was inspired by Little Richard's "Send Me Some Lovin'," which the Beatles played on January 6th. By January 27th, now at Apple Studios, the Beatles were working on the song's arrangement, a take of which was later included on Anthology 3. Paul had the chord structure and melody ready, but since the lyrics needed refining and arrangement wasn't finalized, the song was left out of the Get Back project. When they recorded it properly at EMI Studios on April 20th, "Oh Darling, I'll Never Do You No Wrong," as it was then known, had all the lyrics in place. Other inspirations behind "Oh Darling," beyond its obvious 50s-style pastiche, include the Mothers of Invention's "Cruisin' with Reuben and the Jets," released in December of '68. Frank Zappa's band had played 50s-style doo-wop songs as a tribute to that era. Both John and Paul were actually fans of Frank Zappa, whose earlier album, We're Only in It for the Money, satirized both Sgt. Pepper and the broader hippie and psychedelic movement. Barry Miles, in Paul's biography many years from now, describes the song as reminiscent of Jackie Wilson. It also draws inspiration from the New Orleans R&B sounds of Fats Domino, as well as the Louisiana swamp blues or swamp pop sounds of Slim Harpo's Rain in My Heart. Paul initially wanted to include a spoken word section in "Oh Darling," similar to the Diamonds hit Little Darlin'. The handwritten lyric sheet mentions a talking verse, a feature Paul later abandoned during final recording. Paul's primary concern in the recording of "Oh Darling" was perfecting his lead vocal, a challenging feat. "At first my voice was too clear," he said in the anthology book. "I wanted to sound as though I'd been performing it on stage all week." Geoff Emerick says, "It was at around this time that Paul started getting in the habit of coming in early every afternoon, before the others arrived, to have a go at singing the lead vocal to Oh Darling. Not only did he have me record it with 50s-style tape echo, he even monitored the backing track over speakers instead of headphones, because he wanted to feel as though he were singing it to a live audience. Every day, we'd be treated to a hell of a performance, as Paul put his all into singing the song all the way through once and once only, nearly ripping his vocal cords to shreds in the process. Paul was obsessed with getting the perfect vocal take, often arriving early before the others to record. He tried to sing the bridges without breaking into falsetto, experimenting with different approaches until he was satisfied. The vocal was recorded, re-recorded, and re-recorded multiple times until it was perfect. If Paul thought a certain day's attempt could be acceptable, he would double-track himself during the bridges to see if that would make it even better, sometimes even harmonizing with himself a little. John, who didn't claim any songwriting credit, felt he could have sung it better, though he acknowledged it was Paul's song. Geoff Emerick and others also thought that John's voice suited the song better, but Paul's determination to sing it himself reflected their dynamics at the time. Emerick continues, "Frankly, I think the reason Paul did those vocals each day before the others arrived was so that he wouldn't have to face their disapproval or withering remarks. He wouldn't even play them each day's attempt to solicit their opinion. Perhaps he had learned his lesson from Obla-Di Obla-Da when he had sung the vocal over and over again in front of everybody, pissing off his bandmates in the process." There was one other factor with Paul singing the song, and that was pride. Paul's ego prevented him from ever giving John a stab at singing the lead on Oh Darling, despite the fact that it was a song that was probably better suited to Lennon's voice. Even though John was standing by in the studio, apparently ready, willing, and able, in later years, he admitted that he would have loved to have sung that lead. Paul was determined to give a Lennon performance all by himself. To a great degree, he succeeded, but what a shame it was that by the time the Beatles got to record the song, they were unwilling to ask one another for help. Such was the vibe of the Abbey Road Sessions. Engineer Alan Parsons remembered, "That was a feature of the Abbey Road Sessions. You very rarely saw all four Beatles together. It was either John, Paul, or George working on their various things, perhaps only getting together to hear something back. But Paul came in for several days running to do the lead vocal on Oh Darling, and I remember him saying, 5 years ago I could have done this in a flash," referring, I suppose, to the days of Long Tall Sally and Kansas City. All in all, Oh Darling brilliantly showcases the Beatles revisiting their early rock and roll roots and delivering a powerful performance that rivals the classics that inspired it. The writing of Octopus's Garden will forever be linked with the events of August 22nd, 1968, the day that Ringo left the Beatles. It was on this day, because of Paul's incessantly instructing him on how to play the drums on the song Back in the USSR, that Ringo couldn't stand it any longer, got fed up, and left. According to producer Ron Richards, Ringo came to the conclusion that he wasn't needed in the group and decided to go on vacation with his family. The other three then coaxed him back, Ringo returning to the fold on September 4th, 1968. In the anthology book, Ringo explains his feelings at the time and the events during his absence. "I had a rest, and a holiday was great. I knew we were all in a messed up stage. It wasn't just me, the whole thing was going down. I definitely felt I couldn't take it anymore. There was no magic, and the relationships were terrible. I'd come to a bad spot in life. It could have been paranoia, but I just didn't feel good. I felt like an outsider. Peter Sellers had lent us his yacht, and we went out for the day. We told the captain we wanted fish and chips for lunch, because that's all we ever ate, being from Liverpool. And so when the lunchtime came around, we had the French fries, but there was this other stuff on the plate. He said, 'Here's your fish and chips.' Well, what's this? It's squid. We don't eat squid. Where's the cod? Anyway, we ate it for the first time, and it was okay. A bit rubbery. It tasted like chicken. I stayed out on the deck with him, and we talked about octopuses. He told me that they hung out in their caves, and they go around the seabed finding shiny stones and tin cans and bottles to put in front of their cave like a garden. I thought this was fabulous, because at the time I just wanted to be under the sea too. A couple of tokes later with a guitar, and we had Octopus's garden. So I wrote as much as I could, and I took it back to George, who transposed some of the chords, and it became, I'd like to be in Krishna's garden. No Krishna, I told him. Ringo also went on to explain more about the dynamic of how George would help him with some of his compositions. See, what I used to do, I was great at a verse and a chorus, or 2 verses and a chorus. I could never, finish them. George would round them off for me, and I would play 3 chords, that's all I can play. Then I would give them to him, and he'd put in the passing chords, and there would be 10 chords, and I'd be like a genius.
Like Ringo, he gets bored, playing the drums, and at home he plays a bit of piano, but he only knows about 3 chords, and he knows about the same on guitar. And so the main music he likes is country and western, so it's really got a country and western feel. I think it's a really great song because on the surface it's like a daft kid song, but the lyrics are great, really. For me, I find very deep meaning in the lyrics, which Ringo probably doesn't see, but all the thing like resting our head on the seabed and something, we'll be warm beneath the storm, which is really great, because it's like this level is a storm, and it's always, if you get sort of deep in your consciousness, it's very peaceful. So Ringo's writing his cosmic songs without noticing.
There was a good amount of changes made to the song regarding chord structure and verses between this time and when the Beatles began officially recording it in April of 1969. In fact, during an interview Ringo did in the early months of 1969 with the NME, the title of the song was referred to as In an Octopus's Garden, or I Would Like to Live Up a Tree, possibly indicating that Ringo may have thought about going in another direction, lyrically, at one point. The Beatles entered EMI Studio 2 on April 26, 1969, at around 4:30 p.m., with the intention of working on Ringo's song. George Martin was only sporadically present during these spring Beatles sessions, the documentation for this day indicating the Beatles as the producer of the session. Chris Thomas does distinctly remember being present on this day in the control room, so he undoubtedly contributed to the proceedings. Engineer Jeff Jarrett, who was relatively new to working with the band at the time, recalls the circumstances of working with them. In the book The Beatles Recording Session, he says, "I was really thrown in at the deep end. George Martin informed me that he wouldn't be available. I can't remember word for word what he said to me, but it was something like, 'There will be 1 Beatle there, fine. 2 Beatles, great. 3 Beatles, fantastic. But the minute the 4 of them are there, that is when the inexplicable, charismatic thing happens, the special magic no one has been able to explain. It will be very friendly between you and them, but you'll be aware of this inexplicable presence.' Sure enough, that's precisely the way it happened. I never felt it in any other circumstances. It was the special chemistry of the 4 of them, which nobody since has ever had." They recorded 32 takes of the rhythm track on an 8-track machine. Paul on his Rickenbacker bass, Ringo on drums, George on Fender Stratocaster played through a Leslie speaker, and John playing finger-picking style rhythm guitar on his Epiphone Casino, and Ringo on lead vocals. The Beatles then returned to Studio 2 on July 17th to focus on whatever was needed to complete Octopus's Garden. Still feeling that Ringo's lead vocal overdub was suitable for the finished product, Paul and George, and possibly Ringo, added backing harmonies sung in high pitch before the sound effects overdubs began. John said the following in a 1969 interview about these overdubs. "While I was away, they laid a few harmony tracks on some of the harmony bits, so Ringo is doing a few harmony bits." This indicates that, even though John had reunited with the Beatles after his car accident at this time, he may not have been present on this day. Jeff Emmerich recalls, "We had great fun doing overdubs on Octopus's Garden. Paul and George were both in high spirits on the days we were working on it, and together they chipped in, putting as much effort into it as if it was one of their own songs. Ringo even got the inspiration, recycled from Yellow Submarine, to blow bubbles into a close mic glass of water." Concerning this overdub, technical engineer Alan Brown adds, "That was mic'd very closely to capture all the little bubbles and sounds." Emmerich continues, "As the songwriter, Ringo acted as the de facto producer for the track, and in one of our rare conversations, he asked me if I could make the vocals in the middle section sound as if they were being sung underwater. It was one of the few times during the Abbey Road Sessions that I was challenged to come up with a new kind of sound, and I jumped at the opportunity. After some experimentation, I discovered that feeding the vocals into a compressor and triggering it from a pulsing tone, which I derived from George's Moog synthesizer, imparted a distinctive wobbly sound, almost like gargling. It was weird, almost like something out of a cheesy science fiction movie, but Ringo loved the result. Although no one expected Ringo to write music, he ended up surprising many by co-writing and releasing several hit singles and albums, even surpassing the commercial success of the other Beatles for a few years. In '74, after a brief break from the charts, John sent him a telegram saying, "Congratulations! How dare you? And please write me a hit song." Songs like It Don't Come Easy, Back Off Boogaloo, Photograph, and Oh My My, along with other album tracks, showed that Ringo had picked up valuable skills from his former bandmates.
What about the image of the Beatles? Now, there's no doubt that the older generation who've been very for you, a lot of them have sort of started saying things like, "Oh, they're not like they used to be. What are they doing?" You know, all this hair and they're not
it's
so
true,
snappily dressed. Does this disturb you?
No.
That you might lose some of your old...
See, the thing is, you grow up, everyone grows up, and it is always a great pity to see a baby turn into an adult. Because it's always nicer when they're a baby and they go goo-goo and they do everything you want. It's lovely. And in a certain period in our career, we did, we were sort of particularly nice. We had like a very all-round appeal. It wasn't put on, we were more like that, But as we've grown up, you become more individual. And so, like, for instance, if you don't want a press interview, like these days, we don't have to say yes. We're more true to ourselves these days. And it obviously doesn't please some people, but I think you find like a lot of other people like us for it. I tell you what happened. Once in the old days, we used to wear leather jackets. We used to wear leather suits a lot. And we changed. Brian said, "Look, lads, smarten up a bit, get yourselves suits." So we got suits and ties and stuff, and we went on like that. We gained a whole new audience and lost all the people who wanted us in leather. See, so this is happening again, you know. I think it always will happen that, where we'll lose all the people who wanted us to be just 4 nice, clean-cut lads, and who didn't want us to grow beards.
Yes.
And we'll gain all the people who don't care whether we got beards or what, you know, because they're out for us,
yes.
not for what we look like or how nicely we speak, you know.
Yes.
Just they're out for us being truthful to ourselves. That's what they're interested in.
How much interest and how much control do you have over Apple now that you have a new manager in Mr. Klein?
Are
you like
the
a
four of us have it? No, I don't like doing the business bit that much, but you can't avoid it. See, the thing is, we were once a band, just a band, but then because we were successful, you can't help it being successful. You know, money comes in. You know, you can't help that again. When money comes in, income tax has to be paid. So you can't really help just turning into a businessman because someone says to you, you know, well, where's your income tax, mate? You say, well, I better get on to someone, you know, I hope I've got a bit to pay you and stuff. So you've got to get all that together, you know. So it's just force of circumstance, you know, you can't help it.
Paul, what about the future of the Beatles? I happen to know that the organisers of the Isle of Wight Pop Festival are going to ask you and the rest of the Beatles if you will top the bill next year at the Isle of Wight. Now, what's your reaction to a thing like that? Are you likely to go back on stage and perhaps do a show like that?
I don't know, you know. I don't think so. For me, you see, what happened was when we played the Cavern, when we played the really early days, we really enjoyed performing, you know, and that was the fun, was to perform. But since then, our things got more into records and songwriting, mainly because if you start to perform, after, say, the Cavern, you start to perform at, like, Peterborough Empire, Glasgow Empire, Liverpool Empire, you get an act. And, like, we never used to really vary the act. Occasionally we put a new song in. But you get very stereotyped, you know, and we just got an act. I mean, once you knew the act, there wasn't really much more fun in it, except if anything went wrong or anything went particularly right, you know, but it was normally just, here we go again. So for us, we've done all that you can do in performing. We can get bigger audiences, we can get bigger in quantity, but in quality of performance, it's difficult. You know, I personally, if we were going to do anything, prefer to just go right back to a small club.
You would?
Just have 50 people in and sing to them, you know, and have a bit of a sing-song. I'd get more fun from that.
You would. And what about John? He seems to be...
John loves
to
it,
go
yeah.
back and perform. Isn't this going to cause a sort of division in the group?
No.
I mean...
No, the thing is, John wants to do that, you know, and I think it's great, you know. I mean, see, I've just said I don't particularly like the idea of playing to those many people, but I'd hate to stop him doing it.
Yeah.
I mean, he loves it. He did this Toronto thing and had a really great time. So I'd be the last person to say, well, you know, don't do it because you've got to just do it with the Beatles or stuff. I think it's a great idea anyway. You know?
What do you do about decisions like that? Do you have meetings still and talk things over, or do you just go your separate ways and get together when it comes around to recording?
Yeah,
we're still as much in contact with each other as they were.
We're not as much in contact with each other as we were when we were on the road every day, in the same van, in the same car, same dressing room. Obviously, we're not in that kind of contact. But I think Abbey Road shows that we're in contact. It's not as though it's like a made-up album. We're playing all the way through it, and we play together. So, I mean, we're in contact. We have plenty of meetings. In fact, I've got one any second now, David.
In April 1969, London had more hours of sunshine than in any other month in the 1960s. February and March had been unusually cold. So George likely wrote Here Comes the Sun between April and June 1969, just after a long, cold, lonely winter, as he puts it. Here Comes the Sun was written when Apple was getting like school, where we had to go and be businessmen. Sign this and sign that. Anyway, it seems as if winter in England goes on forever, and by the time spring comes, you really deserve it. So, one day I decided to go and sag off Apple, and I went over to Eric Clapton's house. The relief of not having to go and see all of those dopey accountants was wonderful, and I walked around the garden with one of Eric's acoustic guitars and wrote Here Comes the Sun. It was a bit like If I Needed Someone, you know, the basic riff going through it, you know, all those bells of rhymey, birds type things. So that's how I see it anyway. It's quite vintage. He wrote it using a D major chord with a capo on the 7th fret of one of Eric's guitars, similar to how he wrote If I Needed Someone. Around that time, in early 1969, the Beatles were busy dealing with business issues. They had hired Alan Klein to handle their finances, which led to lots of meetings and stress. Apple secretary Dee Meehan said in Beatles Off the Record, "As time went by, the atmosphere at Apple became terrible. Klein was really mean. He just moved in and started firing people." George also said, "Personally, I hope to get to the point where I can completely retire from the business side of things. Business is one thing. Writing and creating, which is all we want to do, is another thing entirely." George also drew inspiration from other places. John said, "It reminds me of Buddy Holly in a way. This song is just the way he's progressing, you know. He's writing all kinds of songs, and once the door opens, the floodgates open." George once said, "One of the greatest people for me was Buddy Holly. Peggy Sue, a little bit that rubbed off. I no longer have a fear of changing from A to F, which is a chord change that appears in Here Comes the Sun." On July 7th, Ringo's 29th birthday, George introduced Here Comes the Sun to the others. John wasn't there at the time. Before recording could start, George had to explain the song's unusual time signature, especially to Ringo. In the documentary Living in the Material World, Ringo remembered. He said, "Oh, I've got this song. It's like 7.5 times. Yeah, so? You know, he might as well have talked to me in Arabic, you know what I mean? I had to find some way that I could physically do it and do it every time so it came off on time." After a few days of work, the track was sounding great. At least it seemed that way. But on August 19th, George decided to add one more important overdub before the final mix. "I had heard about the Moog synthesizer in America," George said in the anthology book, remembering how he bought the instrument in November 1968 while producing Jackie Lomax's debut album, Is This What You Want, in Los Angeles. The Moog ended up on several tracks from those sessions, thanks to Paul Beaver and Bernie Krause, who brought the massive machine along to try and pique George's interest. Mal Evans wrote in the January 1969 issue of the Beatles Book Monthly fan magazine, "George couldn't resist the idea of ordering one. It will be installed in my home. May well hear the results on the 1969 Beatles records, folks." And Mal was totally right. George explained, "I had to have mine made specially because Mr. Moog had only just invented it. It was enormous, with hundreds of jack plugs and 2 keyboards. But it was one thing having one and another trying to make it work. There wasn't an instruction manual, and even if there had been, it probably would have been a couple thousand pages long. I don't think even Mr. Moog knew how to get music out of it. It was more of a technical thing. When you listen to the sounds on songs like Here Comes the Sun, it does do some good things, but they're all very kind of infant sounds." One trick they used while overdubbing was sticking a bit of editing tape onto the capstan of the tape machine to create a tape delay echo, which gave the Moog a cool, slightly wobbly effect. This whole thing, the songwriting, the arrangement, the production, was George finally getting the space and time he needed to fully express himself. Paul stepped back a bit, letting George take the reins while still helping out as an instrumentalist and arranger. George led the session, guiding Paul and Ringo through what he had in mind, with George Martin no doubt chiming in here and there to polish the final product. George's guitar playing here was sharp and intentional, and his finishing touches with the Moog really tied everything together. Ringo nailed the drum part after carefully studying what George wanted, and Paul chipped in with backing vocals and a bass part that was just right. Not too flashy, since George liked to keep the bass simple. One reason the Beatles' music is so popular is that it reached all kinds of people. Young or old, no matter what kind of music you liked, the Beatles had something for you. Even now, their songs play on all kinds of radio stations: rock, easy listening, oldies, and more. Some of their songs even sound like they're old country hits, or something out of the 30s or 40s. Paul sometimes wrote songs with kids in mind. That's how you got fun tracks like Yellow Submarine and All Together Now. Obla Dee, Obla Da was another one. It had a catchy, sing-along feel that kids liked, and it got a lot of attention when the Wight album was released. But John and George weren't really fans of that kind of song. When Obla Dee, Obla Da was released as a single in some countries, Paul wanted it released everywhere, but the others said no. The same thing happened with Maxwell's Silver Hammer on Abbey Road in 1969. Paul hoped it would be a single too.
He did everything to make it into a single, and it never was, and it never could have been, but he put guitar licks on it, and he had Mal hitting iron pieces, and we spent more money on that song than a whole album, I think.
Even so, the song was catchy and easily remembered. Maxwell's Silver Hammer is something of Paul's which we'd spend a hell of a lot of time on, and is one of those instant whistle type of tunes which, I suppose, some people will hate and some people will really love. George said after Abbey Road was released. It didn't become a single, but kids liked it anyway, even though the lyrics were kinda dark. If parents had paid attention, they might not have let their kids listen to it. Paul said Maxwell's Silver Hammer was his way of showing how things can suddenly go wrong in life. In many years from now, he wrote, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was my analogy for when something goes wrong out of the blue, as it so often does, as I was beginning to find out at that time in my life. He added, I wanted something symbolic of that, so to me it was some fictitious character called Maxwell with a silver hammer. I don't know why it was silver, it just sounded better than Maxwell's hammer. It was needed for scanning. We still use that expression now when something unexpected happens. Years later, in the lyrics, Paul added more. The thing about Maxwell is that he's a serial killer, and his hammer isn't an ordinary household hammer, but, as I envision it, one that doctors use to hit your knee. Not made out of rubber, though, silver. The song is also an analogy for when something goes wrong out of the blue, as I was beginning to find happening around this time in our business dealings. Former Apple employee Tony King explained the song a bit more in A Hard Day's Right by sharing something John told him about instant karma. He said, John told me that Maxwell's Silver Hammer was about the law of karma. We were talking one day about instant karma because something had happened where he'd been clobbered, and he'd said that this was an example of instant karma. I asked him whether he believed that theory. He said that he did, and that Maxwell's Silver Hammer was the first song that they'd made about that. He said that the idea behind the song was that the minute you do something that's not right, Maxwell's Silver Hammer will come down on your head. Paul also talked about this in the Beatles anthology. The song epitomizes the downfalls of life, he said. Just when everything is going smoothly, bang, bang! Down comes Maxwell's Silver Hammer and ruins everything. To get that message across, Paul made up a story to go with it. He said in an anthology, some of my songs are based on personal experience, but my style is to veil it. A lot of them are made up, like Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which is the kind of song I like to write. It's just a silly song about all these people I'd never met. It's just like writing a play. You don't have to know the people, you just have to make them up. I remember George once saying to me, I couldn't write songs like that. He writes more from personal experience. John's style was to show the naked truth. If I was a painter, I'd probably mask things a little bit more than some people. The first line of the song mentions pataphysical science. That's not just a random word. Paul got it from the French writer Alfred Jarry, who'd created it to describe a made-up kind of philosophy. Paul first heard about Jarry in January 1966, when he was driving and tuned into a BBC radio play called Ubu Koku. He said in the lyrics, zooming up the motorway from London to Liverpool in my Aston Martin, I fiddled around on the radio for something and happened on a BBC Radio 3 production of Ubu Koku. And many years from now, he added, It was the best radio play I'd ever heard in my life, and the best production, and Ubu was so brilliantly played. It was just a sensation. It was one of the big things of the period for me. Later on, he even used the name in his own 1990s radio show, Ubu Jubu. A few months after hearing the radio play, Paul saw a stage version of another Jarry play, called Ubu Roy, at the Royal Court Theatre. The lead actor was Maxwell, a performer that Jane Asher, Paul's girlfriend at the time, really liked. Jarry's plays were known for making fun of serious academic topics, and Paul got really interested in Jarry's made-up version of science called pataphysics, which some people describe as the study of imaginary solutions. Paul said, "I put that in one of the Beatles songs," talking about the line in Maxwell's Silver Hammer. Joan was quizzical, studied pataphysical science in the home. Nobody knows what it means. I only explained it to Linda just the other day. That's the lovely thing about it. I'm the only person who ever put the name of pataphysics into the record charts. Come on! It was great. I love those surreal little touches. That was the big difference between me and John. Whereas John shouted it from the rooftops, I often just whispered it into the drawing room, thinking that was enough. In the lyrics, he said, "I liked that people wouldn't necessarily know what pataphysical was, so I liked being a little bit obscure on purpose." Paul does not seem to have realized that Soft Machine had also referenced pataphysics that same year, in the title of his song. You could say that Paul used pataphysics, this idea of imaginary solutions, as a way to show what John was calling instant karma. Like, when life's going great, something random and awful happens to you, just to remind you that you're not untouchable. Some fans have even wondered if Maxwell was actually a reference to the actor Maxwell, who, as we mentioned before, starred in that Ubu Roy play that Paul cited as an influence. However, Paul has put forward a different idea in the lyrics. Maxwell is probably a descendant of James Clerk Maxwell, who was the pioneer of electromagnetism. Edison is obviously related to Thomas Edison. They're two inventor types. Speculating's half the fun. Even though the song sounds cheerful, the lyrics are really dark. George highlighted this after the song came out. It's a honey pie sort of fun thing, but this is pretty sick, because the guy keeps killing everybody. It's kind of a drag because Maxwell keeps destroying everyone, like his girlfriend, his school teacher, and then finally, the judge. He also said it was one of those instant whistle-along tunes which some people hate and other people really like. It's a fun song, but it's kind of sick, because Maxwell keeps on killing everyone. Paul once said during rehearsals that Maxwell was very scholarly, just very straight in a striped tie and a blazer. Music writer Ian MacDonald said it was the cheery tale of a homicidal maniac in his book Revolution in the Head, and said it was, by far, Paul's worst lapse of taste under the auspices of the Beatles. But if you enjoy dark British humor like Monty Python, which actually started airing around the release of Abbey Road, a cheerful-sounding song about murder might not seem so strange. Paul even said in the lyrics, "Also invoked is the world of the children's nursery rhyme, where people are always getting their heads chopped off, and of course there's the Queen of Hearts from Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, who's always saying, 'Off with their heads!'" Ian Brady and Mira Hindley, the Moors murderers, had been jailed for life in 1966 for committing serial murders. That case was quite likely in my mind, as it was front-page news in the UK. During rehearsals in 1969, Paul described the song like this. "It's like Tom Lehrer, that one." Lehrer was a satirical musician known for using sweet-sounding tunes to talk about dark or weird stuff, like in his song Poisoning Pigeons in the Park, which was based on a real method used by wildlife officials. Compared to that, a song about someone being murdered with a silver hammer didn't seem so far off. As for when Paul started writing it, the Beatles Book magazine said in November 1968 that the song already existed but wasn't finished in time for the Wight album. Paul had taken a notebook to India earlier that year and included the first verse of the song, writing Spring Songs, Rishikesh, 1968, on the first page. By January 1969, when the Beatles were rehearsing for the Get Back, Let It Be sessions, he had the chorus and another verse or so. He finished the lyrics later and recorded the vocals in July 1969. That same notebook has different versions of the lyrics too, showing how Paul kept tweaking things. Lines like, "How can she avoid him a third time?" were changed to, "How can she avoid an unpleasant scene?" And another line was rewritten from, "As she turns her back to the board," to, "But when she turns her back on the boy." And if you're wondering whether John had anything to do with writing it, probably not. In 1980, when Playboy asked him, he said, "That's Paul. I hate it." He also called it a typical Paul single, or whatever, and more of Paul's granny music. So yeah, this one was all Paul. The song was originally brought in during the Get Back sessions, but they only found space to continue it several months later on July 9th. They met in EMI Studio 2 at 2:30 p.m. to start work on officially recording the song for the first time, this day going down in Beatles history as a somewhat historic day. 8 days earlier, on July 1st, John and Yoko had been in a serious car accident while on vacation in North Scotland. They both ended up in the hospital, John receiving 17 stitches and Yoko being monitored more closely because she was pregnant at the time. The Beatles had been busy in the recording studio without him working on the album, but this day, July 9th, was the first day that John joined them after the accident. Yoko, while in a fragile condition, was present as well. Engineer Phil McDonald recalls, "We were all waiting for him and Yoko to arrive. Paul, George, and Ringo downstairs on the studio floor, and us upstairs in the control room. They didn't know what state he would be in. There was a definite vibe. They were almost afraid of John before he arrived because they didn't know what he would be like. I got the feeling that the three of them were a little bit scared of him. When he did come in, it was a relief, and they got together fairly well. John was a powerful figure, especially with Yoko, a double strength." Jeff Emmerich explains what occurred just after John and Yoko's arrival. The door burst open again, and 4 men in brown coats began wheeling in a large, heavy object. For a moment, I thought it was a piano coming in from one of the other studios, but it soon dawned on me that these were proper delivery men. The brown coats they were wearing had the word Harrods inscribed on the back. The object being delivered was, in fact, a bed. Jaws dropping, we all watched as it was brought into the studio and carefully positioned by the stairs, across from the tea and toast setup. More brown coats appeared with sheets and pillows and somberly made the bed up. Technician Martin Benge relates, "We were setting up the microphone for the session, and this huge double bed arrived. An ambulance brought Yoko in, and she was lowered down onto the bed. We set up a microphone over her in case she wanted to participate, and then we all carried on as before. We were saying, 'Now we've seen it all, folks.'" Jeff Emmerich continues, "It wasn't as if Yoko was just lying in that bed resting quietly either. There was a long line of visitors there by her bedside, paying supplication almost all the time. Various Beatles would be recording at one end of the room, and she would be lying there at the other end, chatting with friends, making her presence all the more obvious and aggravating to the rest of the band." George Martin had returned on the premise that it was going to be like the good old days. That probably explained why he seemed so depressed and so frustrated during those weeks. Producer Ron Richards reveals that the bed was wheeled around between studios 2 and 3, depending on where John was working. "I was ill after the accident when they did most of that track," John explained in an interview about Maxwell's Silver Hammer. "And it really ground George and Ringo into the ground recording it, you know. I wasn't on Maxwell." Emmerich continues, "There was a distinct change in the atmosphere after John and Yoko arrived. Although personally, I felt it had more to do with John being there than his bedridden wife. He was grouchy and moody, and he flatly refused to participate at all in the making of Maxwell's Silver Hammer, which he derisively dismissed as just more of Paul's granny music." On the following day, July 10th, major overdubs were performed on Maxwell's Silver Hammer in EMI Studio 2, including John and Yoko, around 2:30 p.m. Paul wanted an anvil to be hit at strategic places in each chorus, this being recorded on this day. "There was no thought being given to finding a way to approximate the effect," Emmerich says. "Paul wanted the sound of an anvil being struck, so Mal Evans was dispatched to track one down. There was a proper blacksmith's anvil brought into the studio for Ringo to hit. They had it rented from a theatrical agency. I have a clear memory of him dragging it into the studio, struggling under its weight as the rest of us laughed our heads off. Both he and Ringo had a go at hitting it, but Ringo simply didn't have the strength to lift the hammer, so Mal Evans ended up playing the part. But he didn't have a drummer's sense of timing, so it took a while to get a successful take." Another overdub recorded on this day was The Silver Hammer Man, choral singing by Paul, George, and Ringo for the song's conclusion. The group was recording the backing vocals for the song. Emmerich remembers about these particular overdubs, with both George and Ringo joining Paul at the mic, as an impassive John simply sat in the back of the studio and watched them. After a few uncomfortable moments, Paul strode over and invited his old friend and collaborator to join in. "I thought it was a nice gesture, an olive branch, but an expressionless John simply said, 'No, I don't think so.' A few minutes later, he and Yoko got up and went home. With nothing to contribute, John just didn't want to be there." During the first few days they were back, John and Yoko spent most of their time huddled in a corner, whispering to each other, or they would go down to the hall to the producer's office, the green room, and just make phone calls. It didn't come as a huge surprise to me. I just took it as par for the course. At one point, George Martin even said to me, "I wish John would get more involved." But to my knowledge, he never did or said anything to try to get the recalcitrant Beatle to participate more. John was definitely very awed by this point, and his involvement in the Abbey Road Sessions would be sporadic. For the most part, if he weren't working on one of his songs, he just didn't seem interested. At this late stage of the Beatles' career, it seemed that the best way for them to approach making a record, perhaps the only way, was for each band member to work on his own. But, with regard to the other Beatles, tensions started to mount regarding Paul's intense interest in perfecting Maxwell's Silver Hammer. "The worst session ever was Maxwell," Ringo complained to Rolling Stone magazine in 2008, adding, "It was the worst track we ever had to record. It went on for f***ing weeks. I thought it was mad. We'd spend a hell of a lot of time on it," George complained, adding, "Paul would always help along when you had done his 10 songs. Then, when he got round to doing one of my songs, he would help. It was silly. It was very selfish, actually. Sometimes, Paul would make us do these really fruity songs. I mean, my God, Maxwell's Silver Hammer was so fruity." I got involved in the last 3 weeks of Abbey Road, says engineer Tony Clark in the book The Beatles' Recording History. They kept 2 studios running, and I would be asked to sit in Studio 2 or 3, usually 3, just to be there at the Beatles' beck and call, whenever someone wanted to come in and do an overdub. At this stage of the album, I don't think I saw the 4 of them together.
So I became known as being overpowering. So It was Abbey Road we were doing, Maxwell's Silver Hammer, because I got some grief on that. I took 3 days to do that. Now you know how long Trevor Horn takes to do a mix for Frankie. You know, so that's the strange thing. I feel vindicated as time goes on. I'm beginning to understand what I was doing, and that it was half of it was as innocent as I thought it was. I didn't think we got Maxwell's Silver Hammer right, so I kept pushing to get it right. And they said, "Man, we spent 2 days on this song already." Which, you know, now, 2 days it takes to switch on the Fairlight. It does, man. I had a group the other day, spent 2 days trying to find the on switch. Seriously. But that's what we're into these days, you know. So, let's say, you know, on one of the sessions, it was around about Maxwell Silver Hammer time. This did used to, I'm sure it did piss people off, and much as I tried to not piss people off, obviously, if you are... I don't know, driving force, overbearing, whatever you want to call it, if you are on the ball, perfectionist, whatever, it can annoy some people. Because some people can just say, "Oh, come on, man, hang out, come and just have a just go and have a drink, you know, go have a smoke or something, let's just lie in." Which, you know, I did plenty of anyway. I mean, it wasn't as if I was just a relentless crazy. I mean, I did plenty of the other. It just seemed to me when we had a session booked, it was a cool idea to turn up. You know, but that wasn't always the case. Like Sgt. Pepper, George turned up for his number and a couple of other sessions, but not very much else.
Because George was supposed to have resented you for always getting on his back.
He did resent it. But you see, for instance, 2 examples. One, on Abbey Road, I was beginning to get too producery for everyone. George Martin was the actual producer, and I was beginning to sort of be too definite. And George and Ringo turned around and said, "Oh, look, piss off. We're fed up. Just back off. We're fine, we're grown-ups, and we can do it without you, fine." So I kind of go, oh, one of those people like me who don't realise when they're being overbearing. It can come as a great surprise to actually be told you are overbearing, you know. So I completely clammed up and sort of backed off and sort of went, "Right, okay, I'm burned. Back off. They're right. I'm a turd. Sit here, fine. Okay, guys." So a day or so went by, 2 days, and the session started to flag a bit. Ringo eventually turned and said, "Come on, produce, come on." And so it was like, you couldn't have it both ways, you know. You either had to have me doing what I did, which, let's face it, you know, I hadn't done too bad, or I was going to back off and become paranoid myself, which is what happened. There's a lot of Wings was to do with that I'd been told I was so sort of overbearing that, for instance, if the guitarists in Wings wanted to play a solo a certain way, I wouldn't dare tell them not, that it wasn't a good idea. And the other example that really pissed George off, but I do think I was right, was when we were making Hey Jude, but you're always right, you know, I hear it now, you know, it's still got the same. Anyway, was we were making Hey Jude, and to me, it had to have a sparse opening. Hey Jude, 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 Jude. Just have this intimate opening, and it was going to build, and a kitchen sink, and eventually get to Nirvana, or near Nirvana. Anyway, so I start off, "Hey Jude," and George went, "Don't make it bad, take a sad song, I'll make it better." And George was answering every line through the whole song, and I just said, No, I really don't want that. It's my song. So we always had, the rule was whoever's song it was got to say how the arrangement was. So of course, you know, that pissed him off. And I'm sure I pissed Ringo off when he couldn't quite get the drums to USSR, and I sort of sat in. I'm actually still very aware of that. It's a very weird thing to know you can do a thing that someone else is having trouble with, because one, you make it very simple, but just going down and doing it and just bluffing right through it and thinking, the hell, at least I'm helping. But obviously the paranoia comes in is, but I'm going to show him up. And I was very sensitive to that. I still am. I remember sort of hours sitting around thinking, should I say anything? And in the end, it always came to, you should have said something. So, you know, it's very hard to balance that.
One of the last ones to be recorded, one of John's songs. You know, John was in an accident, so he was off for a period of time, and then when he got back, which was only a week or so before we finished the album, we did this one. So I think he wrote it only a month or so ago, so it's very new. And it's sort of 12-bar type of tune, and it's very it's one of the nicest sounds we've got, actually. Nice drumming from Ringo, and it's sort of up-tempo, I suppose you call it, a rockabeat, a boogie, with very Lennon lyrics as well come together.
It really happened quite organically in the studio. My famous occasion with bass radically altering the whole attitude of the song was when John came in. He come on flat up, he got grooving up slowly, he got juju, he want hold it, roll it. I'm saying, wait a minute. That's Chuck Berry's song. There's a Chuck Berry song, which is called You Can't Catch Me, which not only is like that. Hey, come on, flat top. The opening line is, here come all flat top. I said, look, it's a great song, I love it. I said, but we got to do something to get away from that. Yeah. So I just suggested we slowed it down. So instead of we go.
The initial inspiration for John's iconic song, Come Together, came from an unexpected source in early June 1969. It started with Timothy Leary, the outspoken LSD advocate, who had decided to run for governor of California in the 1970 election, going up against Ronald Reagan. Around that time, Leary and his wife Rosemary were invited to Montreal for John's second bed-in for peace. They arrived on the sixth day, June 1st, and joined John and Yoko in room 1742 of the Queen Elizabeth Hotel. There, the Learys were asked to sing the chorus of Give Peace a Chance, the first single from the Plastic Ono Band. The next day, June 2nd, John thanked Leary for taking part and asked if there was anything he could do to support his campaign.
And Come Together was an expression that Leary and Rosemary had come up with for his attempt at being president or whatever he wanted to be. And they'd asked me to write them a single, a song, a campaign song. And I tried and I couldn't come up with it. But I came up with this Come Together, which would be no good to, they couldn't have a campaign song like that, right? So I wrote another little thing called Come Together and Join the Party, Come Together and Join the Party. And it never got further than that, and they never came back to ask for the song. But I know Leary attacked me years later saying I ripped him off. I didn't rip him off. I had it there waiting for him. It's just that it turned into Come Together. What am I going to do, give it to him?
Really?
After playing around with a few versions, he recorded a demo on the same equipment they'd used the day before, gave it to Leary, and Leary had played it on alternative radio stations across California to support his campaign. But things didn't go so well for Leary. In December of '69, he was charged with marijuana possession, and his campaign fell apart. According to Revolution in the Head by Ian MacDonald, Reagan took advantage of the situation. Implacably opposed to LSD, Reagan saw to it that his challenger was denied bail on a marijuana charge and kept in the Orange County Jail for the duration of the election. Meanwhile, John saw the potential in the song and brought it to the studio just 7 weeks later for Abbey Road. Leary was surprised to hear the song on the radio while in jail. Although the new version was certainly a musical and lyrical improvement on my campaign song, he said, I was a bit miffed that Lennon had passed me over this way. When I had sent a mild protest to John, he replied with the typical Lennon charm and wit that he was a tailor and I was a customer who had ordered a suit and never returned. So he sold it to someone else. When John brought the song into the studio, it still needed work lyrically.
Come Together is me writing obscurely around an old Chuck Berry thing, and I left the line in, although it is nothing like the Chuck Berry song. They took me to court because I'd admitted this once years ago. I left the line, which is not just berries, there's a few flat top in it. Here come all flat top. I could have changed it to Here Come All Iron Face. The song remains independent of Chuck Berry or anybody else on earth. The thing was created in the studio, and the lines are irrelevant.
It's me, writing obscurely around an old Chuck Berry thing, John said, referring to Berry's 1956 song, You Can't Catch Me. In 1970, he added, I was doing that, You Can't Catch Me, and when I got to, I stopped, and then I said, it just came out Come Together, 'cause Come Together was rolling around in my head. The opening line of Come Together, here come old Flaptop, he come groovin' up slowly, closely matches Chuck Berry's lyric. Here come a Flaptop, he was moving up with me. John saw it as a tribute to Chuck Berry. I think it's a compliment to Chuck Berry, not a we resurrected him. Paul remembered it too. That was a lyric John could not let go of. And he couldn't better it, so he just used it. And I said, well, it's a bit of a nick, isn't it? He said, no, it's a quote. I said, okay, fair enough. John also hinted at another rock and roll influence buried in Come Together. At the end of each chorus, he pauses on the words, over me, which he said was a playful nod to Elvis's style. Over me was meant to be like a joke, like Elvis doing Over You, John said in 1970. Another detail in the song is John whispering, shoot me, which repeats throughout the track. This came from a song idea he had earlier that year during the Get Back sessions. It was from a jam called Watching Rainbows, played at Twickenham Studios on January 14th, with just John, Paul, and Ringo. George had temporarily quit. John can be heard saying, shoot me, over and over, just like in Come Together. On July 21st, John brought Come Together to EMI Studio 3, marking it his first new contribution for Abbey Road. The session began at 2:30 p.m. and was significant as it was the first new song John had introduced to the Beatles since April's The Ballad of John and Yoko. As Mark Lewison notes in the Beatles recording sessions, John had been keeping a low profile during recent sessions and had even declined to take part in some of them. But on this day, John was eager to participate. Jeff Emmerich recalls, John was in a pretty good mood that day. He seemed to come to life when we were working on one of his songs, rather than on one of Paul's or George's. True, all three of them exhibited a lack of patience if it wasn't their song. There was always a definite drop-off in interest whenever any one of them was working on another Beatles composition, but John was consistently the most flagrant offender. Come Together was a catchy, hooky tune, and even though it clearly owed a lot to Chuck Berry, its abstract, somewhat risque lyrics had that distinctive Lennon stamp. He adds that the original version John played was faster than what was eventually recorded. Come Together changed at a session, John explained. We said, let's slow it down. Let's do this to it. Let's do that to it. And it ends up however it comes out. I just said, look, I've got no arrangement for you, but you know how I want it. He added, give me something funky, and set up a beat, maybe, and they just all join in. In many years from now, Paul noted, I laid that bass line down, which very much makes the mood. That was my contribution to that. Emmerich confirms this, saying, it was Paul who suggested it be done at a slower tempo, with a swampy kind of sound, and John went along with it uncomplainingly. He always took well to constructive criticism. Emmerich continues, despite John's improved frame of mind, there were clearly still underlying tensions. The band kept breaking into long, pointless jam sessions, and I could see that John was treating Paul in an offhand manner. On July 22nd, following work on Oh Darling, they continued work on Come Together. Paul came up with the electric piano lick, Emmerich says, that pretty well defines Come Together. John even made a point of playing the piano line once he'd looked over Paul's shoulder and learned the part. That would never have happened in the old days. Both men knew that Paul was the better piano player, and he normally would be manning the keyboards even if they were recording a Lennon song. Finally, in some frustration, Paul blurted out, what do you want me to do on this track, John? John's reply was a diffident, don't worry, I'll do the overdubs on this. Paul looked a bit hurt, then angry. For a moment, I thought there was going to be an explosion. Instead, he contained himself, shrugged his shoulders, and simply walked out of the studio, one of the few times he ever left a session early. Paul had to have felt humiliated, but rather than having a fight or an argument about it, He chose just to get up and leave without any dramatics. The next day, he returned, and nothing further was ever said about it. On July 25th, following overdubs for Sun King, Mean Mr. Mustard, vocal harmonies were added to Come Together. Emmerich states that John not only sang the lead vocal, but also did all of the backing vocals on Come Together by himself. Paul later commented, "Even on Abbey Road, we don't do harmonies like we used to. I think it's sad." But isolated tracks suggest Paul did sing the backing vocals. And many years from now, Barry Miles mentions, Paul recorded a lot of heavy breathing on the end, but it was buried so deep in the mix as to be inaudible. In the end, everyone was pleased with the track. "Great record," Paul said in Anthology. George remarked, "Nice drumming from Ringo. I suppose you'd call it a rocker." John added,
"It's one of my favourite Beatles tracks. Well, one of my favourite Lennon tracks, I'd say that. It's really the kind of music I like.
Yeah, the beginning.
You know, it's funky, it's bluesy, and I'm singing it pretty well. And I like the sound of the record. You can dance to it, I'll buy it."
Even though the song is still mostly seen as John's work, Paul had a big role in arranging the song in the studio, and ideas often got tossed around during recording. "I wrote 2 lines to Come Together," George said in a 1987 interview. In the end, that one Chuck Berry line, "Here Come Old Flat Top," ended up giving John a lot of headaches later on. Chuck Berry's publisher, Morris Levi, didn't see it as a tribute and filed a lawsuit. Unlike Timothy Leary, Levi wasn't going to let it slide. Often considered the most recognizable track on Abbey Road, and one of the most iconic tracks from the band's later years, Come Together immediately sets the tone for the band's brief but distinct new direction from the first moments of the recording. The phrase, "come together," intentional or not, was viewed by a good many as a call to action of sorts as we were entering the new decade. The Beatles spoke, and everybody listened. Remembers, "I was lying in bed one night, and instead of trying to sleep, I was trying to think of an idea for a song. The song started going around in my head, and then I thought, oh, this is okay. This is pretty good." So I got up quietly. Linda and I had just recently gotten married, and I didn't want to wake her or daughter Heather, and went downstairs, where I had a little reel-to-reel tape recorder. I closed all the doors so I wouldn't make too much noise, and I wrote this. It's basically a song for Badfinger. Fairly straight-up rock and roll. Very straightforward. One of the best unofficial Beatles songs, Come and Get It is a clever mix of steady, straightforward chords and a bouncy, offbeat melody. Arriving an hour early for an Abbey Road session on July 24th, he quickly laid down a take of voice and piano, following this with overdubs of bass, drums, vocals, and maracas. The entire session was quick and focused. Engineer Alan Brown recalled, "Paul was in and out in under an hour. He had everything in his head already. He just wanted to get it down. He even told us exactly how he wanted it mixed." The song is usually described as a demo for the band Badfinger, which was signed by Apple Records and whose nearly identical version hit number 4 on the UK charts 6 months later.
Mal is beautiful. Mal was our roadie. Mal brought Badfinger to Apple. And he said, great band, you know. And he'd kind of discovered them. And I listened to him and said, great band. I said, but you go, they're going to need a hit, you know. So like one night, I kind of was in bed and I couldn't go to sleep. So just ran downstairs and had this little idea and did the rough idea for Come and Get It. And then we were set up to make a Beatles album. Can't remember which one it was. We were set up. So we were all in the studio. The drums were mic'd. Everything was mic'd for the next day, you know, on the album. So I just ran in because I lived real near the studio. So I just ran in. And Phil McDonald was the engineer. I said, Phil, everyone's going to get here in half an hour. I said, look, just before they get here, I want to do a quick demo. I said, I know exactly what I want to do. Get the mics. Go now. Get it. Drums first. In about half an hour, I think, we made that demo. Then I said to Badfinger, I said, now it's got to be exactly like this. And they were kind of young band. They said, well, no, we're going to do it a little bit different. Want to get our own thing, you know, Welsh boys. I said, no. I said, do the rest of the album like that. But this is going to be exactly like this because this is the hit. And you know, in the end they did. And then Pete Ham, who was a great writer, wrote Without You, which is like just a killer song of all time that Harry Nilsson did. But then it gets sad because then Pete went and chopped himself, you know. And
But according to Paul, he actually offered it up as a possible Abbey Road track. John was in the control room when this was recorded, and the fact that he didn't come out to sing on it probably shows he wasn't too interested. Or maybe he thought that there were enough McCartney tracks already on the album.
We used to get together once a year and say, okay, we'll go to Japan, New York, so-and-so this year, because we all fancy it. We've never been before. So these days, because we aren't performing, we don't have to do that. But we do get together and say, we'll do an album then, we'll do an album then, and we'll do an album then. Because that's mainly what we do.
What about another Beatles picture?
We've done a film which is like very different from anything we've done. Actually, we haven't done it. The film was made around about the time we were making Get Back. They did a film here in Apple, out in Twickenham, all over the place, and it's like a documentary. You know, it's like a film, say, of a painter, and he comes in and sets up a canvas, puts one brush mark on, then eventually you see him finish the painting, and it's all that he goes through to get to the painting. Well, with us, it's just somebody walk in, twang G and C and say, this is how the song goes, and then eventually you see us finish the record. It's like it's the stages. It's a good film. It's interesting, you know.
Yes. What do you feel is left for you to do? What are the Beatles going to be doing when they're 40? Do you think you'll be
I've no idea,
retired?
You know. I don't know, you know, I've never known. I didn't know that when we were playing at the Cavern that we'd be on the Royal Variety performance. And after that, all the papers said, well, what's left for them, you know? So then we went to America. They said, what's left for them then, you know? Then we got into making better albums and stuff, you know. I mean, I just don't know what's going to happen. It'll be all right, though.
Did you know Yoko's trained as a classical musician? John said in an interview. In college, she majored in classical composition. In an NME article from May 3rd, 1969, John shared, I've just written a song called Because. Yoko was playing some classical bit, and I said, play that backwards. Yoko and I stimulate each other like crazy. I said, give me them chords backwards, and I wrote Because on top of it. I don't know whether it was Beethoven or something. In the background, you can hear Yoko saying, Moonlight Sonata. Yoko had trained as a classical pianist, but stopped playing because her father made fun of her small fingers and told her she'd never be good enough. She moved into composition and focused more on avant-garde art. But sometimes she'd still play music for John. Because was written around March 1969, and you can actually hear John playing what sounds like the song on acoustic guitar during Amsterdam, a track on the Wedding album. The piece Yoko was playing was actually the Adagio sostenuto section from Beethoven's Piano Sonata No. 14, mostly known as the Moonlight Sonata. Steve Turner points out that while Because sounds very similar to the sonata, it's not really the chords played backwards, just a simple variation on them. As for the lyrics, John said, the lyrics are clear. No bullshit, no imagery, no obscure references. He had moved on from surreal lines like tangerine trees and marmalade skies, and Semolina Pilchard climbing up the Eiffel Tower. From now on, he wanted his lyrics to come straight from the heart, whether poetic or about his love for Yoko. But Paul thought there might be more to it, and many years from now, he said, "I wouldn't mind betting Yoko was on the writing of that. It's rather her kind of writing. Wind, sky, and earth are recurring. It's straight out of Yoko's 1964 book of poems, Grapefruit, and John was heavily influenced by her at the time." An interesting note is that while I'd Love to Turn You On had gotten A Day in the Life banned by the BBC very famously, the similar style line, "Because the world is round, it turns me on," in Because, didn't make waves when it came out 2 years later. Times had definitely changed. On August 1st, John introduced the song Because to the other Beatles at EMI Studio 2. Geoff Emerick recalled, "John had written the song on guitar, gently picking individual notes rather than playing chords, but he felt that something more was needed. 'Why don't I double your line exactly on harpsichord?' George Martin suggested. And John quickly agreed. 'Yeah, great! That will help make it a little more classical-like, too.' Ringo, acting as a human metronome, kept time with hand claps. We didn't have drum machines in those days, so Ringo was our drum machine," Martin added. They recorded 23 takes of the backing track, with only takes 1, 16, and 23 making it through the full song. Emerick remembered the recording process as exhausting. Hunched over their instruments, deep in concentration, they labored for a long time on that backing track. It wasn't really their fault. Paul, who was acting as their surrogate producer, while also playing bass, was pushing them too hard that night, having them do take after take, playing way past their peak. When the exhausted trio finally came up to the control room to have a listen, they realized that they had laid down a perfectly good take an hour before. John didn't say anything, but he shot an embarrassed Paul a dirty look. Fortunately, they seemed too tired to make an issue out of it. For the next 2 hours, the focus shifted to recording vocals. Emerick noted, everyone agreed that the song was begging for big, lush harmonies, just the kind of thing that was George Martin's forte. Delighted to be contributing at last, he spent considerable time with John, Paul, and George gathered around the piano while he worked out their complex parts, note by note. John explained, "As for the harmonies, I just asked George Martin, or whoever was round, what's the alternatives to thirds and fifths, as they're the only ones I know, and he would play them on a piano, and we'd say, 'Oh, we'll have that one.' So I couldn't tell you what they are. I just know it's harmony." Emerick added, "The only problem was that George Martin had worked out 9 harmony parts for the Beatles to sing, but we only had 5 tracks to record them on. That was resolved easily enough when it was decided to have John, Paul, and George sing their 3-part harmony together live, instead of overdubbing each part one at a time, and then having them do 2 additional passes in order to add on the remaining 6 parts. It was as much an aesthetic as it was a technical decision, because their voices had always meshed so well naturally. George recalled, "The harmony was pretty difficult to sing in. We really had to learn it. We've never done something like that for years, since a B-side," referring to Yes It Is. George Martin commented, "John, Paul, and George sang the song in harmony. I was literally telling them what notes to sing." Although Emerick described the arrangement as 9 harmony parts, it was in fact a 3-part harmony sung by John, lead, George, lower, and Paul, high falsetto. These 3 parts were then overdubbed twice more, creating a total of 9 vocal lines, which gave the song its rich texture. It was mid-afternoon, Emerick remembered, but the lights in Studio 2 were dimmed way down low for the atmosphere. The 4 Beatles, Ringo was there too, providing moral support, were gathered in a semicircle, the sparse backing track playing softly in their headphones. To start with, everyone was standing up, but it quickly became apparent that this was going to be a time-consuming process, so they were soon sitting on regulation EMI hardback chairs, not stools. To get the phrasing spot on, Paul was making hand gestures, conducting the others. It would take more than 5 hours to get those vocals done, and though John's patience was sorely tried that afternoon, no one gave up. Perfection was the goal, and nobody was prepared to accept anything less. pitching was not a problem. They rarely sang out of tune, and they were good at remembering their parts. But it wasn't easy to get the phrasing precise, starting and ending each word at exactly the same time. Even John was unusually patient that day, though he rebuked Paul once or twice. At one point snapping, "Jesus Christ, give me a break already. I wish I hadn't written the bloody thing." That day, I saw the four Beatles at their finest. There was 100% concentration from all of them, even Ringo, sitting quietly with his eyes closed, silently urging his bandmates on to their best performance, all working in tandem to get that vocal nailed, spot on. It was a stark example of the kind of teamwork that had been sorely lacking for years. It's tempting to imagine what the Beatles might have been able to accomplish if they could have only captured and sustained that spirit just a little longer. Voila! The song was complete.
Why did you use the lyric "turn me on" and "blow my mind" in that particular song? I rather felt that sounded a bit passé in 1969 because it's been used so much in the past.
Yes, well, they were John's lyrics. But I think, if they'd have been straight... Yeah, no, I'm not taking any blame, but no. If they'd have been used just straight, if it had been "you turn me on, you blow my mind," okay, that would have been passé. But to say that because the world is round, it turns me on, it's great.
Yes,
it's it's not fantastic, but it's as good as good enough for me,
Yeah.
And because the wind is high, it blows my mind.
Yeah.
It's much better than "you blow my mind, baby, honey bunch."
But how do you get from that democracy and that spirit, to a situation where you had this acrimonious bust-up? I mean, what was it? Was there an inevitability about it?
No, well, yeah, I think that too, but I think it was business. It was money, that old thing that we started the interview with, really, Whereas it's wrecked millions of marriages, I suppose it wrecked this one. We used to play Monopoly, and I was never very good at Monopoly. I never really enjoyed it. I'd get a little bit too wound up in the middle of it. Some people could just play it, and it was a game. I always got a bit intense. So when it came to the real thing, and this was real money now, I got ever so intense. And it fell to me to kind of save our fortune, because we had an American bloke came in. Alan Klein. And it appeared to me that he was going to have it. And I think if I hadn't have done anything, I think he would have. In the first year, he had a fairly hefty management fee. And we had all sorts of rows, about, I was saying he'll take 15%, and the other guys, John mainly was kind of besotted with him. He'd got in via Yoko, who John was incredibly besotted with, and good luck to him too. But it had brought in Alan Klein because he'd promised her the world. It was really how it happened. So I knew I had to kind of do something, and in the end I had to actually sue to get out of this thing. I said, well, look, can I just have my bit of the ball, please, and can I just leave the pitch? They said, no, you can't do that. They were all tied in and so on. So it was put to me that I'd have to sue someone. So I said, well, Alan Klein. They said, no, unfortunately, he's not party to any of the agreements. It's the others you'll have to sue. So it was probably one of the worst moments in my life.
Reliving it in the book, it comes across as that. And you said that when the Beatles split, that it was like a bereavement for you.
It was very difficult for me, yeah. It was my whole life, I think, I think the others, in their minds, I think John was lucky because he'd got this new direction now with Yoko. I think John all his life had wanted to cut loose. He'd been an art student. He'd sort of buckled down a bit for the Beatles because it was democratic. And I think he wanted to cut loose. He wanted to do all these things he'd read about artists in books doing. And I think Yoko gave him that opportunity. And a lot of what they did together was very fine stuff. But I think when it came to the Beatles, it meant that he kind of had to leave the group. He couldn't do it within the group. So, it was very difficult for me.
And then what was sad too was the way that it drove a wedge between your relationship, John, and was it always a spiky relationship, though? I mean, you said you loved him, and that love comes through in the book. Did he love you?
Yeah, I don't think it was... Yeah, I think he did, actually.
Did he?
We'll check. Just excuse me for a moment. John, come on, baby, did he? Yes. No, I think he did, yeah. It wasn't actually a spiky relationship at all. It was very warm, very close, and very loving, I think. All the Beatles. We used to say, I think we were amongst the first sort of men to come out openly, because you remember, it was quite strange in those days. We're talking about a long time ago now, and homosexuality was still sort of largely illegal.
Sure.
We used to say, I love him, on interviews. And the interviewers would get slightly taken aback if a man saying he loves him. And I think, quite genuinely, I think we really did, and I still do. But the business thing came right in the middle of it, and the lawyers came along with the business thing. And I talked to John many years later, because the great saving grace was we did put our relationship back together.
You did, I mean, that's...
Thank God for that, because I don't know what I'd do now with him gone if we hadn't. I think I would be sort of racked with all sorts of guilt. But we did. And in chatting to him, he said, one of the first things he said when we met after the breakup and things had calmed down, he said, do they try and put you against me like they put me against you? Do they try and do that? I said, by golly, they do. He said, yes, that's good. Good to know. He said, because they're always trying to pit me against you.
We can't really break down the Abbey Road medley track by track like we would with a typical set of songs. It was designed to be experienced as one continuous piece, an extended musical journey rather than a collection of separate songs. Because of that, it makes more sense to treat it as a single, unified work, and that's why it's getting its own dedicated segment. It all starts with You Never Give Me Your Money. The song's structure is pretty unique. It jumps between different sections without repeating verses or choruses, kind of like John's Happiness is a Warm Gun. Another inspiration was Keith West's 1968 track, Excerpt from a Teenage Opera. Eventually, with support from George Martin and the rest of the band, Paul started putting this idea into action. I think it was my idea to put all the spare bits together, but I'm a bit wary of claiming these things, Paul said in Anthology. I'm happy for it to be everybody's idea. Anyway, in the end we hit upon the idea of medleying them, and giving the second side a sort of operatic structure, which was great because it used 10 or 12 unfinished songs in a good way. At first, John seemed interested in the idea. In a May 1969 NME interview, not long after the Get Back single came out in April, John discussed the upcoming album, which was still being called Get Back at the time. The next great Beatle event will be the next LP in about 8 weeks, he said. A lot of the tracks will be like Get Back, and a lot of that we did in one take. We've done about 12 tracks. Some of them are still to be remixed. Also, Paul and I are now working on a kind of song montage that we might do as one piece on one side. We've got 2 weeks to finish the whole thing, so we're really working at it. That suggests that they were thinking about putting the song montage on the Get Back album, which they hope to finish by June 1969. Producer Glyn Johns did assemble a version of the Get Back album on May 28th for a planned summer release, but the montage wasn't included. And that album never came out anyway. By then, Paul had already written You Never Give Me Your Money, and John had Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam from the year before, but it was clear that the montage wouldn't be done in time. So in June, they decided to make a whole new album instead, which turned into Abbey Road later. This gave them more time to work on the medley while putting Let It Be on hold. In any case, Paul had originally written You Never Give Me Your Money as the opening to the medley. He had 3 song fragments that he hadn't finished on their own, so he strung them together. Talking about the medley as a whole, Paul said, "We did it this way because John and I had a number of songs, which were great as they were, but we'd finish them. It often happens that you write the first verse of a song, and then you've said it all and can't be bothered to write a second verse, repeating or giving a variation. So I said to John, have you got any bits and pieces that we can make into one long track? And he had, and we made a piece that makes sense all the way through. The first section, the soft piano part with the title lyrics, was about the Beatles' money problems, especially their dealings with Alan Klein. This was me directly lambasting Alan Klein's attitude to us, Paul said. No money, just funny paper, all promises, and it never works out. It's basically a song about no faith in the person that found its way into the medley on Abbey Road. John saw the humor in it. Paul didn't really interact with Klein while writing the song, but he definitely heard from the others about what Klein claimed he could do. He was a New York spiv who had come over to London, Paul said. I smelled a rat, but the other chaps didn't, so we had to fight over it, and I got voted down. Paul tried to avoid any direct confrontation with Klein by staying busy with studio work. But on May 9th, during a mixing session for the scrapped Get Back album, Klein showed up with an ultimatum.
I'd put forward Lee Eastman, Linda's dad, as a possible sort of lawyer and possibly someone to do. But they said, no, he'd be just too biased against you, for you and against us, which I could see.
Oh, yeah, well, we had great arguments with Paul. Well, the three of us felt, the three of us have gone this way, why don't you?
So there it was, and that then was a 3-to-1 situation. And in the Beatles, if any one doesn't agree with the plan, it was always vetoed. It's very democratic that way. So the 3-to-1 thing was very awkward. And things would happen like, I remember being at Olympic Studio one evening, and we were supposed to be doing something on Abbey Road, I think. The three guys showed up, we all showed up at the studio ready to record, and Alan Klein showed up as part of the party with his sort of henchmen. And they said, you've got to sign a contract for Klein. He's got to take it to his board. I said, it's Friday night. No, he doesn't work on a Saturday. Anyway, Alan Klein's a law unto himself. He hasn't got a board he has to report to, I said, don't worry. So we could easily do this on Monday. Let's do our session now. You're not going to push me into this. They said, oh, you're stalling. They said he wants 15%, he wants 20%. I said, tell him he can have 15%. They said, you're stalling. And I said, no, I'm working for us. We're a big act. I remember the exact words, we're a big act. The Beatles, he'll take 15%. But for some strange reason, I think they were so intoxicated with him that they said, no, he's got to have 20% and he's got to report to his board tomorrow. You've got to sign now or never, kind of thing. I said, right, that's it. Well, I'm not signing now. It was a big argument. And they all went, leaving me at the studio. The thing with Apple was that we were great creators and we could do all of that, but we were nobody had half an idea about a budget. So, what we were spending, I think, was more than what we were earning.
There was nobody managing Apple. It was going, wasting away all this money. Nobody had any ability to be a business manager.
And so it was a question of who was going to do it, because I was doing it, but I was doing it on the basis that I'll do it until you find somebody who you want to do it, because I didn't want to do it. So that's why, somebody like Alan Klein had the opportunity to come in and say he could do it, but so did a lot of other people. What changed at Apple after he arrived? Everything. It was a completely different situation, Number one, right, first and foremost, Paul wasn't there.
Klein had been managing the Rolling Stones, and I believe Donovan. And John had met him, and he just came in one day and said, well, I'm going to get Klein to manage me, and that's what's happening.
And Alan was a human being, the same as Brian was a human being. It was the same thing with Brian in the early days. It was assessment, and I make a lot of mistakes character-wise, but now and then I make a good one,
Many months later.
A week ago today, 3 of the original 4 Beatles, John, George, Paul and Ringo, finally parted company with their fast-talking American manager, Alan Klein. A highly significant announcement for pop fans, because one of the reasons given for the original breakup of the Beatles was that after Brian Epstein's death, John, George and Ringo wanted Klein to manage the Beatles' complex business affairs and disagreed with Paul, who was against Klein and who wanted Lee Eastman, his wife's father, as manager.
John, can you tell me what happened with Alan Klein? Why did you and the other two try to decide finally to get rid of him?
Well, there are many reasons to finally give in the push, although I don't want to go into the details of it. Let's say that possibly Paul's suspicions were right, and the time was right. At the time, I do whatever I feel is right. And although I haven't been particularly happy personally for quite a long time with the situation. I didn't want to make any quick moves. And I wanted to see if maybe, something could work out.
The alternative to Klein, really, was possibly Lee Eastman, but I'm not at all sure that, Paul wanted Lee Eastman to be a manager in the sense that, Brian Epstein had been a manager, or Alan Klein to be a manager in the sense of Brian Epstein being a manager.
Since the first section of You Never Give Me Your Money had already been written and partly recorded 3 days earlier, it wasn't inspired by this event specifically, but Paul had clearly shown his concerns about Klein long before that. The second unfinished section, which Paul called Out of College in his personal notebook, seems to reflect the Beatles' early days, leaving behind school and ordinary jobs to take a chance on their dreams. They didn't have much money, but they were chasing that magic feeling of doing what they loved. On the original lyric sheet for this part, Paul ended with the phrase, "know where to go," and crossed out the K, obviously suggesting a double meaning. Others might have thought the Beatles had nowhere to go, but they knew exactly where they were headed. After a dramatic instrumental break, we heard the third section, One Sweet Dream, which Barry Miles describes as being about Paul and Linda's habit of going on aimless countryside drives. Paul said, "We used to like to escape London, and we'd just drive, going nowhere. We would try to get lost." Linda recalled, "As a kid, I loved getting lost. Then, when I moved to England to be with Paul, we would put Martha in the back of the car and drive out of London. I'd say, 'Let's get lost,' and we'd keep driving without looking for any signs. That's where lines like, 'Soon we'll be away from here, step on the gas and wipe that tear away,' came from." Paul also wrote Two of Us about these same drives. Around December of '68, John started writing a new song for Yoko called Don't Let Me Down. He mixed this with another idea where he swapped the words, "Here comes the sun, whoa, the sun," with "Don't Let Me Down." This version first showed up on January 2nd, 1969, during rehearsals at Twickenham Film Studios, the first day of the Get Back sessions. At this point, John was playing the chords in a unique way, using what some people call pull chords. You can hear a bit of this on the Fly on the Wall bonus disc from Let It Be, Naked. As they kept working on Don't Let Me Down later in January, the pull chords were dropped, but John kept playing around with them and began turning them into a new song. This version still included the Here Comes the Sun line and slowly evolved into what became Sun King. And even if it was only subconscious, this might have sparked the idea for George's Here Comes the Sun, which he wrote a few months later. John's early version of Sun King didn't have a name yet, and seemed to sit in the back of his mind for a while. It was just half a song I had, which I never finished, which was one way of getting rid of it without ever finishing it. Then in the medley, we just wanted a change of atmosphere, and Here Comes the Sun King. Why not? And here he comes, and everybody's happy, and quando per mucho, etc., etc. In 1980, John added, "That's a piece of garbage I had around." Even though George had already started recording his own Here Comes the Sun, John still decided to keep the original idea and lyrics from back in January. According to Steve Turner, John said Sun King came to him in a dream, suggesting it felt like an inspired piece of work. That may be true, but John was also known to be a big reader. Barry Miles suggests that John might have gotten the idea from the 1966 book The Sun King by Nancy Mitford, about Francis Louis XIV, or maybe even from a review of it. A Hard Day's Right even imagines that John had a dream wherein the king entered his palace to find all his guests were laughing and happy after reading the book. Fast forward to July 24th, John brought the song into EMI Studios and finished writing and recording it, now calling it Here Comes the Sun King. He explained, "We just started joking, it's cod. Singing Cuando para mucho, so we just made it up. Paul knew a few Spanish words from school, so we just strung any Spanish words that sounded vaguely like something. And of course we got chica ferdi in. That's a Liverpool expression. Just like, it doesn't mean anything. Just like childish taunting, na 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 na. The one we missed, we should have had, was paranoia. We forgot all about it. We used to call ourselves Los Paranoias. Cake and eat it is another nice line too, because they have that in Spanish. Que or something can eat it. On July 24th, John brought in a more developed version of Here Comes the Sun King for the medley. That same day, he also introduced another incomplete song, Mean Mr. Mustard, with the intention of recording both together as part of the medley. Jeff Emmerich relates how these two songs were both recorded together in a single pass. There's a slight gap between the two songs, so they could have easily been recorded separately. But knowing in advance that they would be sequenced in that order, John made the decision to play through them in one go, which made it a little more of a challenge to the band's musicianship, but they pulled it off. Emmerich also recalled John being in good spirits, despite having recently been in a car accident with Yoko in Scotland. Yoko, who had a bed brought into the studio during earlier sessions to help her recover, no longer needed it, though the bed remained in the corner. John was actually in a pretty good mood throughout the entire session. I could see that he was a bit looser, a little more recovered from his injuries, and a lot less worried about Yoko, who was no longer lying in the bed, though it remained unmade in a corner of the studio, a mute reminder of the weirdness we'd had to deal with over the past few weeks. George explained in '87. At that time, Albatross by Fleetwood Mac was out, with all the reverb on guitar. So we said, let's be Fleetwood Mac doing Albatross just to get going. It never really sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but that was the point of origin. Actually, I do think they kind of sounded like Fleetwood Mac, but whatever. Emmerich continues. The vibe was so good that, this time around, Paul was invited by John to participate in both songs, which seemed to lift his spirits greatly. They even disappeared behind the screens at one point for a puff on a joint, just the two of them, and when they came out, they had a fit of giggles as they sang the pseudo-Spanish gibberish at the end of Here Comes the Sun King. In fact, they found it impossible to get through a take without dissolving into laughter. It really was a group effort, and all four Beatles played with energy and enthusiasm, each making his own unique contribution to the sound and arrangement. Even Ringo came up with a strong idea, draping his tom-toms with heavy tea towels and playing them with timpani beaters to give John the jungle drum sound he was after. This approach actually mirrored how Mick Fleetwood played drums on Albatross, though Ringo had to quickly switch to regular sticks for the Mean Mr. Mustard segment. John explained the inspiration behind Mean Mr. Mustard in his 1980 Playboy interview. I'd read somewhere in the paper about this mean guy who was hiding 5-pound notes, not up his nose, but somewhere else. And so I wrote about him. And no, it has nothing to do with snorting cocaine. In fact, 2 newspaper articles appear to have influenced Mean Mr. Mustard. The first, from the Daily Record, dated June 7th, 1967, was titled, "A Mean Husband Shaved in the Dark." It described a man who shaved and went to bed in the dark to save electricity, and insisted on turning off the lights while listening to the radio, because it was not necessary to see in order to listen. This probably inspired John's lyric, "Shaves in the dark trying to save paper," with paper referring to money. The second article, published the same day in the Daily Mirror, was titled "Scotsman Meanness Was Cruel." It stated, John Mustard, an exceptionally mean man, gave his wife only £1 in the year before they parted. The judge said that there was a menacing quality about him, to which his wife was particularly sensitive. John Alexander Mustard, 65 years old at the time, lived in Old Park View, Enfield, in North London, with his second wife, Freda. He died in 1984. The reference to £1 may have inspired John's lyric, "Keeps a 10-bob note up his nose," though the rest of the story was clearly shaped by John's imagination. Tony Bramwell, a former Apple Records executive, suggested another possible source of inspiration. In A Hard Day's Right, he said, "There was an old bag lady who used to hang around the Knightsbridge end of Hyde Park, close to the army barracks. She had all of her possessions in plastic bags and slept in the park. I'm sure that she had something to do with the song." This theory, however, has never been confirmed. Originally, John wanted the song to be a standalone track, potentially for the Wight album. A demo recorded after the Beatles returned from India, later released on Anthology 3, indicates a bridge section that segues back to the first verse. In this demo, the character's sister was originally named Shirley, possibly referencing Shirley Evans, the accordionist in the Magical Mystery Tour film. The demo also is John uttering the word sheeps before the lyric, "sleeps in a hole in the road." Since the released version also includes the word sheeps, some have speculated that John may have meant the character was defecating in the hole, although this has also never been confirmed. John says, "My contribution is Polythene Pam, Sun King, and Mean Mr. Mustard. We juggled them about until it made vague sense. In Mean Mr. Mustard, I said his sister Pam. Originally, it was something like his sister Shirley in the lyric. I changed it to Pam to make it sound like it had something to do with it." Only the first two verses were used in the final album version. The bridge was never completed. John later dismissed the song, calling it a bit of crap. Paul, however, had a more positive view. Mean Mr. Mustard was very John. I liked that. A nice quirky song. One notable choice during the recording was having Paul play his Fender jazz bass through a fuzzbox during the Mean Mr. Mustard section. He had to manually switch from the clean tone used during Sun King. It's not difficult to picture Mean Mr. Mustard as a fully developed Lennon track on the Wight album, but within the context of this long medley, this shortened version of the song fits much better. Following the laid-back atmosphere of John's Sun King, the medley is re-energized by what Tom Riley calls in his book Tell Me Why, a short, punchy rock and roll sketch. That's another half a song I wrote in India about a kinky girl in a polythene bag, John said shortly after Abbey Road came out.
An island off the French coast which belongs to English, and a man called Roy something, who was England's answer to Allen Ginsberg, who gave us our first exposure. This is so long, you can't deal with all this. You see, everything triggers amazing memories.
Yeah.
I'll get his name later because I'm getting tired now, and it's hard work to pull things out. He was a beatnik that looked like a beatnik, and he came, and there weren't any jazz groups, there was only the Beatles, so it was the first rock and roll and poetry. He read poetry and we played blues, and he mentioned us in the paper. Years later, he had a job in Jersey TV. I met him when we were big and on tour, and he took me back to his apartment. I had a girl, and he had one that he'd said, you want to meet her? Polythene Pam. She dresses up in polythene, which she did in polythene bags, and she didn't wear jack boots and kilt. I just sort of
She looks like a man.
Elaborate. No, not really that. Just Polythene Pam's enough inspiration, isn't it, to start a whole ball game, right?
Yeah.
So that's what that was. based on a real
Kind
incident.
of like the news of the world. Yeah.
Yeah, well, it was kind of, perverted sex in a polythene bag. There was nothing really much to it. It's just looking for something to write about.
It's a bit like everything, Not Fade Away by the Crickets and Summertime Blues by Eddie Cochran. When asked what Polythene Pam was about, he explained it was about a mythical Liverpool scrubber dressed in her jackboots and kilt. By scrubber, he meant a fan or a groupie, possibly suggesting she was promiscuous. The girl John likely had in mind was Pat Dawson, then known as Pat Hodgett. She was a regular at the Cavern Club when the Beatles played there in the early days. She was known for eating polythene, a British term for polyethylene, a type of plastic. Because of that, the Beatles nicknamed her Polythene Pat. John remembered this years later when writing Polythene Pam. I started going to see the Beatles in 1961 when I was 14, Pat says in A Hard Day's Write. And I got quite friendly with them. If they were playing out of town, they'd give me a lift back home in their van. It was about the same time that I started getting called Polythene Pat. It's embarrassing, really. I just used to eat polythene all the time. I'd tie it in knots and then eat it. Sometimes I even used to burn it and then eat it when it got cold. Then I had a friend who got a job in a polythene bag factory, which was wonderful because it meant that I had consistent supply. The poet John mentioned, England's answer to Allen Ginsberg, was Royston Ellis. He met the Beatles in May or June of 1960 when he came to Liverpool University to read poetry. That July, he arranged for them to back him at a poetry and music show at the Jacaranda Club. A piece in Record and Show Mirror from July 9, 1960, even said Ellis was thinking of taking the Beatles to London. I was quite a star for them at the time, Ellis recalled in A Hard Day's Write, because I'd come up from London, and that was a world they didn't really know about. I stayed with them for about a week in their flat at the Gambier Terrace during that 1960 visit. John was fascinated by the fact that I was a poet, and that led to deep conversations. The Beatles saw Ellis again during their 1963 tour, but that meeting actually took place in Guernsey, not Jersey, as John mistakenly said. A photo from August 8, 1963, shows Ellis with the band on Guernsey. He had a summer job there working as a ferry boat engineer, and met up with John after the show at his attic apartment. Years later, Ellis was interviewed for A Hard Day's Write. Not being involved in the British music scene anymore, Ellis wasn't aware of Polythene Pam, but he did remember what happened that day with his girlfriend at the time, Stephanie. We'd read all these things about leather, and we didn't have any leather, but I had my oilskins, and we had some polythene bags from somewhere. We all dressed up in them and wore them in bed. John stayed the night with us in the same bed. I don't think anything very exciting happened, and we all wondered what the fun was in being kinky. It was probably more my idea than John's. I can't really remember everything that happened. At that time, it meant nothing to me. It was just one event during a very eventful time in my life. Paul didn't help write Polythene Pam, but he also remembered that day. In his book, he writes, John, being Royston's friend, went out to dinner with him and got pissed drunk and stuff, and they ended up back at his apartment with a girl who dressed herself in polythene for John's amusement. So it was a little kinky scene. She was a real character. The line, "she's the kind of girl that makes the news of the world," refers to the British tabloid News of the World, which was known for covering celebrity scandals. So the idea of perverted intercourse in a polythene bag could have easily been the kind of story the paper would publish. Polythene Pam was arranged to directly link into Paul's "she came in through the bathroom window." Apart from A Day in the Life, this was the first time two individual Lennon-McCartney songs were recorded and arranged as a single piece. Jeff Emmerich recalled the session. Things weren't quite so pleasant. John was unhappy with Ringo's drumming, commenting acidly at one point that it sounded like Dave Clark of the Dave Clark 5, which was clearly not meant as a compliment. He was so impatient at Ringo's inability to come up with a suitable part that he finally said, "Sod it, let's just put one down anyway." But Ringo was upset that John was unhappy with his drumming, and he spent a good deal of time working on it with Paul, even after the backing track was done. Finally, he said to John, "Why don't we just record the backing track again? I think I've got a part you'll like now." But John waved him off. "I'm not playing the bloody song again, Ring. If you want to redo the drums, go ahead and overdub them." That night, Ringo did just that. Fortunately, we were working in 8-track, so I was able to record the new drum track without erasing the old one. It took many hours to do, but Ringo eventually pulled it off, managing to play the new drum part from start to finish without losing the beat. And those were the days before we had click tracks, so his only reference was the original drum track, which we fed to him through headphones. Paul overdubbed his bass on Polythene Pam, and at one point he overshot the note on one of his glissandos. Instinctively he said, "Oops, let me drop that in and fix it." But we all spontaneously overruled him, saying, "No, it's great, leave it in." Even George Martin got into the spirit of things. When someone made a mistake like that and the others liked it, we'd often actually make it louder when we mixed the song so as to accentuate it. Sometimes we would even double track the mistake with other instruments to make it even more obvious. It was all about playing a little joke on the fans, giving them a treat, something to talk about. That's what we did on Polythene Pam. Paul's overshoot actually became a feature. For all of the kerfuffle, they were fun tracks to record. I commented to George Martin that it sounded like old-style Beatles, like the four of them playing together as a band circa 1963. "You're right," George said sardonically. "You'd never guess that the four of them actually can't stand each other." Then, George played the descending electric guitar line linking Pam to Bathroom Window. John re-recorded his lead vocal, now using a pronounced Scouse accent, and adding an ad-lib during George's guitar solo. "Fab, isn't that great? It's real good, that. Real good. Listen to that, Mal," he said, referring to Mal Evans. As the transition into Bathroom Window began, John shouted, "Oh, look out," a portion of which made it onto the final version. Originally, Paul's short acoustic piece, Her Majesty, was placed between Mean Mr. Mustard and Polythene Pam, but Paul didn't like the result and asked for Her Majesty to be removed, with Mustard now leading directly into Polythene Pam. In a September 1969 interview, John said that She Came In Through the Bathroom Window began in mid-May of 1968. It was when Paul and I went to America to publicize Apple about 2 years ago, and we were just in the flat we were staying in, and he had just come out with that line, "She came in through the bathroom window." So he had it for years, and he eventually finished it. John and Paul's visit to New York was to promote AppleCore through various press events, including an appearance on The Tonight Show, but not with Johnny Carson, sadly. Before this trip, an unusual event occurred at Paul's home in St. John's Wood, involving a few Apple scruffs, which was what the Beatles called the devoted fangirls who regularly waited outside their studios, offices, or homes. Diane Ashley, one of the fans, described the event. We were bored, he was out, and so we decided to pay him a visit. We found a ladder in his garden and stuck it up at the bathroom window, which he'd left slightly open. I was the one who climbed and got in. She then let a few others in through the front door. "I don't regret any of it," she said. "I had a great time. A really great time." Another Apple scruff, Margot Bird, said they rummaged around and took some clothes. People didn't usually take anything of real value, but I think this time a lot of photographs and negatives were taken. There were really two groups of Apple scruffs, those who would break in and those who would just wait outside with cameras and autograph books. I used to take Paul's dog for a walk and got to know him quite well. I was eventually offered a job at Apple. I started by making the tea and ended up in the promotions department, working with Tony King. While working at Apple, Paul asked Margot for help retrieving some of his belongings. I knew who had done it, and I discovered that a lot of the stuff had already gone to America, she remembered. But I knew that there was one picture he particularly wanted back, a color-tinted picture of him in a 30s frame. I knew who had taken this and got it back for him. Ian MacDonald suggests the photo was actually of Paul's father, which would make sense given the description. Diane Ashley, who had climbed into Paul's house through the bathroom window, was surprised to hear the event made it into a Beatles song. I didn't believe it at first because he'd hated it so much when we broke in. But then I suppose anything can inspire a song, can't it? I know all his neighbors rang him when they saw that we'd gotten in, and I'm sure that gave rise to the lines, Sundays on the phone to Monday, Tuesdays on the phone to me. I did have some of those out-of-the-ordinary ideas, Paul said. For example, I used to see the days of the week in colors. Monday was black, Tuesday was yellow. Wednesday's green, Thursday was dark blue, Friday was red, Saturday was orange, and Sunday was white. When I saw the name of the day of the week, I pictured them like that. It's a form of synesthesia. So the lines, Sundays on the phone to Monday, Tuesdays on the phone to me, are particularly resonant for me. I use essentially the same device in Lady Madonna, where I have Friday night arrives without a suitcase, and Sunday morning creeping like a nun. It seems to be fruitful ground for me. The lyric, protected by a silver spoon, also had a personal meaning for Paul. In the lyrics, he wrote, even though my mother was never anything more than a nurse or midwife, and my dad never anything more than a cotton salesman, we always thought of ourselves as posh working class. It's a mental attitude. Our attitude was posh. We aspired to do better in every department. We usually associate the idea of being born with a silver spoon in your mouth with nobility. But even in my, albeit posh, working-class family, I was given a silver spoon at the time of my christening. I knew nothing about it until, years later, my Auntie Dill told me that she had kept it safe for me. Literally and metaphorically, until my mom died. I had quite a lucky childhood. I was protected by a silver spoon. While some lyrics relate directly to Paul's experience with the Apple Scruffs, others appear more imaginative, such as her being a dancer who's worked at 15 clubs a day, and who could steal but could not rob. Paul reflected, a nice distinction if ever there was one. The rest of the lyrics remain mysterious or personal to Paul. I think music can be a very visual art, really, he said. It's image-driven. We can see the dancer working 15 clubs a day. We can see the character quit the police department. The meaning of wanders by the banks of her lagoon remains unknown. She came in through the bathroom window was an easy choice for the medley, so Paul brought it back and added it right after John's unfinished Polythene Pam.
I think a lot of people might be surprised that you sort of dared to take Golden Slumbers, the well-known lullaby, and give it a new variation. I enjoyed it very much, but what made you decide to do that? Because the Beatles have never done that before, have they?
No.
Taken another tune or lyrics?
No. Well, I'll tell you, I was just playing the piano in Liverpool, my dad's house, and my sister Ruth's piano book, she was learning piano, and you know those sort of, do you ken John Peel? Yeah. And the Golden Slumbers and your old favourites was up on the thing, you know, it was a stand, you know, there's a little book with all those words in it and stuff. So I was just flicking through it and I came to Golden Slumbers, you know. So I just started because I can't read music, so I didn't know the tune. I can't remember the old tune, you know. So I started just playing my tune to it. And then I liked the words, so I just kept that, you know, and then it fitted with another bit of song I had, which is the verse in between it, so I just made that into a song. It just happened because I was reading a book.
He shared a bit more in Many Years From Now. I liked the words so much, I thought it was very restful, a very beautiful lullaby, but I couldn't read the melody, not being able to read music. So I just took the words and wrote my own music. I didn't know at the time it was 400 years old. This all happened sometime in 1968, when Paul visited his dad's house, Rembrandt, in Heswall, Cheshire, about 15 miles from Liverpool. Paul had bought the place for his dad back in July 1964, once the Beatles started making good money. Paul's mom had died when he was 14, and his dad, Jim McCartney, later remarried a woman named Angela. And that's how Paul ended up with a stepsister, Ruth, the same Ruth whose piano book he was flipping through that day in 1968. It was later set to music in 1885 by W.J. Henderson, under the title Golden Slumbers, Kiss Your Eyes. It first showed up in a 1603 play called The Pleasant Comedy of Patient Grizzle. By the time Paul found it, the piece was long out of any potential copyright, so there was no issue in using it. Paul had a vague memory of the lullaby from when he was younger too, which makes sense since he said, "I couldn't remember the old tune." Here's the original poem by Thomas Dekker. Golden slumbers kiss your eyes. Smiles awake you when you rise. Sleep, pretty wantons, do not cry, and I will sing a lullaby. Rock them, lullaby. Care is heavy, therefore sleep you. You are care, and care must keep you. And I will sing a lullaby. Rock them, lullaby. Paul said, it fit with another bit of song I had. In the lyrics, he also talked about where some of the emotion behind the lyrics may have come from. It's very possible that I'd been feeling down in London. I was back in the solace of family and Liverpool, and what with the Beatles' troubles down south, I was likely thinking, wouldn't it be nice to get home and have that comfortable feeling again? So there may have been some of that in the background. I wouldn't rule it out. When I wrote the song, I hadn't been back home to Liverpool for a long time. But now I was at my dad's house, which wasn't quite home because it was a house I'd bought him when I got some money. But it was still Liverpool, and it was still homeward. So I added, once there was a way to get back homeward, once there was a way to get back home. The song turned out to be quite soulful, and I think that's what attracted me to those lyrics in the first place. That notion of consoling a baby or reading kids a bedtime story. Later on, when putting together the big medley, Paul thought it would work well to pair Golden Slumbers with a reprise of You Never Give Me Your Money, which he had written a few months later. It worked musically as they were both in the same key, and shared a general feeling of sad farewell, as Ian MacDonald put it in Revolution in the Head. Jeff Emmerich reveals, no one was sure how John would react to the medley idea, but we got on with the work anyway. There seemed to be an assumption that he would go along with it, and that this time around, in contrast to the Wight album, he wouldn't be calling the shots. John was actually on board after all, as he said in a May 1969 interview that he liked the idea of a kind of song montage that we might do as one piece on one side. Even though Golden Slumbers and Carry That Weight are separate songs on the album, the session notes just called the whole thing Golden Slumbers at the time. The orchestral part was recorded on August 15th in Studio One, but there was a technical challenge, as Emmerich explained. EMI had still not installed an 8-track tape recorder or large-scale console into the Studio One control room, so we were forced to set up a complicated system of audio tie lines and closed-circuit television that allowed the musicians to be seated in the larger Studio One while we recorded them in the control room of Studio Two. The orchestral recording covered mostly Paul's songs, Golden Slumbers, Carry That Weight, and The End. Emmerich added, "Following the pattern that had been established for much of the album, the only Beatle at this session was Paul. Phil McDonald, however, was there with me, working in 2 studios at once, really complicated things, and we needed the extra pair of hands. George Martin did the conducting while Paul essentially produced his own session. Thankfully, there were no major technical mishaps, and everything worked smoothly." Engineer Alan Brown recalled in the Beatles recording sessions, "It was a mammoth session. We had a large number of lines linking the studios, and we were all walking around the building with walkie-talkies trying to communicate with each other. It costs a lot of money. All the musicians have to be paid, fed, and watered. I screw every pound note out of it whenever I play the record." John shared his thoughts about the orchestral stuff in a 1969 interview. He laid the strings on after we had finished most of the basic tracks. "I personally can't be bothered with strings and things. I like to do with the group or electronics, you know. I can't be bothered with the hassles of the musicians and all that bit, you know. It's such a drag trying to get them together, but Paul digs that. So that's his scene, and it was up to him where he went with the violins, really, and what he did with them. I think he just wanted a straight kind of backing, you know, nothing freaky." The orchestra took about 3 hours to record Golden Slumbers / Carry That Weight and The End, all put on track 8 of the tape. The musicians followed George Martin's score exactly. The balance of the lyrics and the melody line found in Golden Slumbers, amid the piano backdrop and the orchestral swells, portrays the sentiments of nostalgia and longing, while his lyrically similar "Get Back to Where You Once Belonged" implied a musical return to form for his band. Paul's aching "Once There Was a Way to Get Back Homeward" created the feeling that if only we could go back to a time in our childhood, all would be right in the world. In the bosom of our mother, we could happily fall asleep while she sang us a lullaby. With the later realization that this was the opening portion of the last musical segment of the last recorded Beatles album, not counting the humorous snippet, Her Majesty, an even more poignant message emerges that particularly resonates with their fans. The message becomes, "It was a fun ride that we're very glad you joined us in, but there is no going back. It's now time to part, but don't cry. The memories are always there to cherish." There are quite a few Beatles songs that took shape in the recording studio different from how they were originally conceived. John's Come Together was originally intended as a Chuck Berry-style rocker until it was transformed into a more subdued, swampy-sounding hit song. I'll Be Back was attempted in the studio in a waltz beat, as shown in Anthology 1, and Paul's tender acoustic ballad, And I Love Her, was first tried as a full band arrangement with electric guitars and drums. However, probably the biggest transformation to a Beatles song from what the composer originally intended would be Carry That Weight. Sometime around December 1968, Paul came up with this upbeat country-style tune called Carry That Weight. It had a bit of that Buck Owens vibe, you know, sort of like Act Naturally, which the Beatles had already covered during Help. Ringo's idea, of course. Paul's plan was to write verses about a guy who had a pretty good life, but let little problems get to him. Each verse would lead into the catchy chorus. The whole thing was meant to sound like it was from the guy's point of view. When Paul first showed the song to the rest of the band during Get Back, he was sitting at the organ and saying, "I was thinking it was a song for Ringo." Since every album had a Ringo song, he figured this could be it. But the idea of it being a Ringo song didn't last. The next day, Paul slowed it down and paired it with Golden Slumbers, turning it into a medley. He played the combo on piano during rehearsal. The big Abbey Road medley idea wasn't around just yet, but this ended up being a big part later. A few days later, on January 9th, Paul played the medley again for Ringo and explained where it came from. He told Ringo, "It's like a story, a bit like Act Naturally, where a tagline keeps coming up, you know. So and so and so and so." But all he said was Act Naturally. It's like your troubles, but it was like a comedy when I first heard or conceived it. Later on, though, Paul talked about the song like it came from a darker place. I'm generally quite upbeat, but at certain times, things get to me so much that I just can't be upbeat anymore. And that was one of those times. Carry that weight a long time, like forever. That's what I meant. The weird part, Paul actually wrote the song before all of the Alan Klein drama. Klein didn't even meet with John until late January 1969. Still, by the time they were recording it for Abbey Road in July and August, Paul was right in the middle of all that mess, so he probably started connecting the song's vibe to the tension in the band. In the lyrics, Paul explained, "We were entering a period in the mid to late 60s when we were doing LSD, staying up all night. That period weighed on me. It was a place you just didn't want to be, with people you didn't want to be with." The idea of carrying a weight may have been influenced by the band's song, The Weight. There's a great picture that Linda took of Alan Klein, in which he's got a hammer like Maxwell's silver hammer. It's very symbolic. And that's why we have the little nod and wink in the middle section. In the lines, "I never give you my pillow, I only send you my invitations." Tim Riley explains Carry That Weight as the larger implications of fame and notoriety, obligation and commitment, the weight in the singer's heart. He then goes on to state that the ironies become palpable. The love song Paul sings to the Beatles spells out the price that fame has extracted from their friendship. Ian MacDonald says, "No matter what they do separately after this, Paul correctly guesses it'll never match what they did together, and the world will always hark back to their glory days as a foursome, and they'll carry the weight of their achievement as the Beatles for the rest of their individual careers." Both of these interpretations are very fanciful, to say the least, retrospectively assuming that Paul was summing up his band's career and song. And to think, Carry That Weight was just Paul simply wanting to write a fictional country and western song for Ringo to sing. The Beatles song The End, which wraps up Abbey Road, is often seen by fans and writers as their big farewell message. But was it actually meant that way? As they kept working on the medley, they realized it needed a strong ending. And as the 70s approached and hard rock was starting to take shape, Paul decided the medley on Abbey Road should go out with a bang. Something loud and powerful. Bands like Jimi Hendrix, Cream, Led Zeppelin, and Mountain were leading the way with this new heavy guitar sound, and the Beatles decided to lean into that vibe too. So, on July 23rd, they recorded a tight, distorted guitar jam to close out the medley. At that point, it was just called Ending, and lasted about 1 minute and 20 seconds, stopping abruptly. If you picture the final version cutting off right before Paul's soft piano chords, that's actually originally what it sounded like. But Paul wanted to go a little deeper. Not just noise, he wanted meaning. Soon after, he came up with a more thoughtful ending to follow the heavy guitar part. By early August, he added a final lyrical idea to wrap things up properly. In Many Years From Now, Paul explained, "Shakespeare ended his acts with a rhyming couplet so that the audience would know they were over. I wanted it to end with a meaningful couplet, so I followed the bard and wrote a couplet. John was into it too. In 1980, he said, it had a nice line in it. The love you take is equal to the love you make. It was a very cosmic, philosophical line. It proves that if Paul wants to, he can think." So the final form of The End came together in July and August of 1969. John later gave Paul the full credit for the song, so it's safe to call it a McCartney creation. Still, Paul made sure to leave space in the song for each of the guys to shine, with solos from all three guitarists, and even a rare drum solo from Ringo. A fitting finish, even if it wasn't meant to be the band's last word. "Solos have never interested me," Ringo said. "That drum solo is still the only one I've done. I was opposed to it. I don't want to do no bloody solo. George Martin convinced me. As I was playing it, he counted it because we needed a time. It was the most ridiculous thing. I was going dum dum 1 2 3 4, and I had to come off that strange place because it was 13 bars long. Anyway, I did it, and it's out of the way. I'm pleased now that we've got one down. George Martin was in the studio with the group instead of the control room for the recording, the purpose apparently being to help Ringo keep the drum solo measures straight, and to stipulate when his bandmates were coming back in to conclude the song. Even after extensive coaching from Paul, Ringo wasn't sure if he was going to play, and I could see that he wasn't the least bit confident that he could pull it off either. We had to do a lot of takes, and each take was quite different. The final solo he played was actually considerably longer than what eventually made it onto the album. With input from Paul and George Martin, I edited down significantly, using only the best bits. There was a particular inspiration that Ringo had for his drum solo. Ron Bushy, drummer from the rock group Iron Butterfly, explains in Andy Babiuk's book Beatles Gear, "We played London back in '71, and Ringo and Paul came to see us. Ringo sent up his man backstage and invited me out to a private club called Tramps. We had dinner and drinks, and we were up all night shooting the shit. He told me then that he kinda copped my solo in Agata Divida for their song The End on Abbey Road. And I just thought, that was cool. It was the biggest compliment that I could ever get." An interesting event happened while the Beatles were in the control room, listening back to the result of Ringo's solo, as witnessed by Jeff Emmerich. When the four Beatles trooped upstairs to listen to some playbacks, Yoko stayed behind, stretched out languorously in the bed, wearing the usual flimsy nightgown and tiara. As we were listening, I noticed that something down in the studio had caught George's attention. After a moment or two, he began staring bug-eyed out the control room window. Curious, I looked over his shoulder. Yoko had gotten out of bed and was slowly padding across the studio floor, finally coming to a stop at George's Leslie cabinet, which had a packet of McVitie's digestive biscuits on top. Idly, she began opening the packet and delicately removed a single biscuit. Just as the morsel reached her mouth, George could contain himself no longer. "That bitch!" Everyone looked aghast, but we all knew exactly who he was talking about. "She's just taken one of my biscuits," George explained. He wasn't the least bit sheepish either. As far as he was concerned, those biscuits were his property, and no one was allowed to go near them. John began shouting back at him, but there was little he could say to defend his wife, who, oblivious, was happily munching away in the studio, because he shared exactly the same attitude towards food. Actually, I think the argument was not so much about the biscuits, but about the bed, which they had all come to deeply resent. What Harrison was really saying was, if Yoko is well enough to get out of bed and steal one of my biscuits, she doesn't need to be in the bloody bed in the first place. It almost didn't matter what the argument was about. By this stage, whenever the four of them were together, it was like a tinderbox, and anything could set them off, even something as dumb as a digestive biscuit. Emmerich continues, "There were quite a few empty bars to fill after Ringo's drum solo. Paul had left them bare in the spirit of, we'll think of something eventually, just as we had done with the middle section of A Day in the Life. And there was a long discussion about what to add on top to flesh it out. Well, a guitar solo is the obvious thing, said George. Yes, but this time you should let me play it, said John jokingly. He loved playing lead guitar. He'd often mess about doing lead parts during rehearsals. But he knew that he didn't have the finesse of either George or Paul, so he rarely did so on record. Everyone laughed, including John, but we could see that he was at least half serious. I know, he said mischievously, unwilling to let it go. Why don't we all play the solo? We can take turns and trade licks. It was a suggestion that clearly had merit. George Martin looked dubious, but Paul not only embraced the idea, but upped the ante further still. Better yet, he said, why don't all three of us play it live? John loved the idea. For the first time in weeks, I saw a real gleam in his eye. It didn't take long for John's enthusiasm to rub off on George, who finally got into the spirit of things. Paul announced that he wanted to take the first solo, and since it was his song, the others deferred. Ever competitive, John said that he had a great idea for an ending, so he was going to go last. As always, poor George was overshadowed by his two bandmates, and he got the middle spot by default. Yoko, as usual, was sitting by John's side in the control room while they were having this discussion. But as John got up to walk out into the studio, he turned to her and said gently, "Wait here, love. I won't be a minute." She looked a little shocked and hurt, but she did as John asked, sitting quietly by the control room window for the remainder of the session. It was almost as if he knew that she would put a damper on things and spoil the atmosphere if she were in the studio with them. Something inside told John that to get this to work, he needed to be doing it with just Paul and George, that it would be better for Yoko not to be by his side this one time. Maybe that was the reason. Or perhaps on some subconscious level, they decided to suspend their egos for the sake of the music. But for the hour or so that it took them to play those solos, all the bad blood, all the fighting, all the crap that had gone down between these former friends was forgotten. John, Paul, and George looked like they had gone back in time, like they were kids again, playing together for the sheer enjoyment of it. More than anything, they reminded me of gunslingers, with their guitars strapped on and looks of steely-eyed resolve, determined to outdo one another. Yet there was no animosity, no tension at all. You could tell that they were simply having fun. It was the first time in a long time that the three of them were actually playing together in the studio. For most of the Abbey Road sessions, it was just one or two of them, plus sometimes Ringo. For me, that session was undoubtedly the high point of the summer of 1969, and listening to those guitar solos still never fails to bring a smile to my face. If the good feelings engendered by that one day had only been present throughout the entire project, there's no telling how great Abbey Road would have been. Now, you'd think that this dramatic, final-sounding song, complete with Ringo's only drum solo and Paul's famous line, "And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make," had to be their planned goodbye. But that's not actually how it went down. The last time all four Beatles were in the studio together was August 20th, 1969. They were there to finalize the Abbey Road track list. And here's a twist. Originally, side one of the album was going to end with a big medley, ending with, well, the end. Side two was supposed to finish with "I Want You, She's So Heavy," John's intense, dramatic track. So, at first, they didn't intend for the end to be their last goodbye at all, just a cool wrap-up to the medley. Still, retrospectively, it was the perfect last hurrah for the Beatles. It made Paul's closing line feel way more profound, and listening to it today, it really does feel like the Beatles riding off into the sunset forever. Whether or not that was the plan, hey, it's a beautiful way to imagine it. But wait, there's more. In his book Many Years From Now, Paul said he wrote Her Majesty while staying in his Mull of Kintyre home in southwest Scotland. He said, "It was quite funny because it's basically monarchist, with a mildly disrespectful tone, but it's very tongue-in-cheek. It's almost like a love song to the Queen." Derek Taylor added, "Paul sang that knowing the Queen would enjoy it. We are monarchists."
And what about the reference to the Queen? What made you put that on the LP? That's caused a lot of surprises. Very nice, but it was, a lot of people didn't know it was there.
I saw your column in the daily newspaper.
I wish I could have got a hold of you.
That was just, I don't know, I was in Scotland and I was just writing this little tune. I can never tell, how tunes come out. I just wrote it as a joke, I wrote this tune and it happened to start off, Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl. She doesn't have a lot to say. So I just wrote those little, I wrote a few more lines with it. And just as a little sort of joke tune, Her Majesty, I thought of it as the Queen, just because I'd think of that as Her Majesty. Well, it was around about the time the royal family was on telly too. Yes. That big film about them. You could refer, like they refer to a girl as... lady or girl or, like Lady Madonna or just some sort of name, to call a girl. Mm. It could be that too, like Her Majesty, worshipping your girlfriend or your wife.
Yes, I see. So it's not to be taken too seriously.
Not really, you can if you like.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yes.
Paul gave more detail in his book, The Lyrics. You're sitting around with an acoustic guitar, just for your own fun, and then you get a little idea, and sometimes it's enough to finish up a big song. Her Majesty was just a little fragment, really. I didn't know what to do with it. It's tongue-in-cheek, treating the Queen as if she were just a nice girl, and not bothering with the fact that she would become the longest-reigning monarch ever in the UK, or the fact that she was the Queen of the nation. It's just being cheeky. Her Majesty's a pretty nice girl, but she doesn't have a lot to say. That seemed to be true. She doesn't say much. Only the annual Queen's speech at Christmas, and at the opening of Parliament. The song's melody and structure seem to be inspired by Robert Johnson's 1936 recording, They're Red Hot. Paul never said this was his direct influence, but the similarity is too strong to be a coincidence. It's likely that he drew on music from the 1920s and 30s, since his dad had introduced him to that era of music. As for when it was written, Radio Luxembourg DJ Tony MacArthur remembered, "When the Beatles' double album was released, at the time I did a program with Paul, and he played Her Majesty to me at that time. In fact, it was on that White Album tape, when we were just getting levels and things. So it must have been written and recorded as a demo by November 1968. Decades later, Paul was one of many guest performers who played at the Party at the Palace at Buckingham Palace Garden in London on June 3, 2002. This event was in commemoration of the Golden Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth II, Her Majesty herself being in attendance. When introduced toward the end of the show, Paul's first act was to perform Her Majesty, replacing his finger-picking style with straight chords, undoubtedly because it had been so long since he had last played it. After its conclusion, he stated, "I had to do it." As the camera focused on the Queen, she didn't seem impressed. She undoubtedly had never heard the song before. "I did perform this song for the Queen," Paul recalled in his book The Lyrics. "I don't know how to break this to you, but she didn't have a lot to say."
First of all, congratulations on another super LP from the Beatles.
I personally like it better than the last one that we did.
You do?
The double album, yeah. So I like the songs a bit better. I think it's more of an LP. It's very good.
What were your own favourite numbers? Which were you particularly satisfied yourself on this LP? Which ones stand out?
Well, I like Come Together. That's a great one, which is John's one.
Yeah.
I like Something, George writes. I think it's, for me, I think it's the best he's written. Because, on the second side, I like all the others. I think there's not a bad track on it, but my favourites are those ones. And then the long one.
Oh, yeah.
The whole of the long one, the whole of the end bit. I think that works good.
The Abbey Road album comes out in '69.
Yes. Yeah.
Phil McDonald gets credited as being the engineer in the album, and you may have something to say about what actually happened there, why he's credited on it, and what you did as work on it.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're both credited, but what happened, I'd worked at Abbey Road for, I don't know, 9 years, up until, was it 69, 68, when the album came out?
69, right. Yeah.
So I left to join Apple as the Apple man. So then Paul says, we're going to record a new album, which was to become the Abbey Road album. So the sessions are booked into Abbey Road, and Abbey Road said, well, Jeff can't do it. He's an independent engineer after 9 years. So I'm going back into the same studio I've worked in for 9 years. Oh, no, we don't allow independent engineers, right? I couldn't have my name on the tape boxes or the recording sheets, which is, I mean, when you think about it, it's so disgusting. After working for Abbey Road for 9 years, and you come back like 2 weeks later and you're not allowed in the studio because you're now independent.
And it's a fabulously engineered album.
Well, yeah, and that's when we first went into the transistorized world, because of the Red 51 desk being the tube desk, which had all that clout and punch. And when they brought the TG desk in, which had beautiful facilities on it with selectable equalization and compressors and limiters and so forth, and many inputs into the mixing console, because there's no mono version of Abbey Road. It was recorded for stereo for the first time. And it gave me the luxury of being able to record drums in stereo. But what happened when we first lifted the faders up, we couldn't get the same punch on the bass drum or the snare sound or the guitars or the bass. And we're sort of down in the mouth for like three days. And I said, well, why can't we get the original mixing console then? Well, we can't, So anyway, we sort of accepted the fact that this is what we're now recording with, but because it's got the most magical organic texture to that album, which again was the concept of that was like it just came into being, because if those original rhythm tracks on Abbey Road had been recorded through the tube desk, they would have had so much more punch. And consequently, all the overdubs would have had more punch to actually complement the original punch in the basic rhythm tracks. So that album would never, ever sound the way it sounds. And it was just listening to it, recently, it's just the most beautiful sort of sound, which was sort of, again, I guess, getting into the artistic value of this, say all the other albums that were recorded through the Red 51 desk were painted in oil colours, which had more depth and more pigment. Maybe you can say the Abbey Road album was done more in watercolours. That's the only way I can describe it. There's so much more depth. It wasn't just like vivid colours. There was more depth in the tonalities of the instruments. That's the only way I can describe that.
And it was a very happy record. I guess it was happy because everybody knew it was going to be the last. I think the Beatles have gone through so much, and it was a long time. They've been incarcerated with each other for nearly a decade. And it was a very, very happy album. Everybody worked frightfully well, and that's why I'm very fond of it.
It takes a lot to live with four people over and over for years and years, which is what we did. And we'd called each other every name under the sun. We'd got to blows. We'd been through the whole damn show. We knew where we were at. We still do. We'd been through the mill together for more than 10 years. We've been through our therapy together many times,
and a lot of days, even with all the craziness, it really works still. Instead of working every day, it worked like 2 days a month. And there were still good days. We were still really close friends, Then it would split off again into some madness. I think it shows on the record that when we were excited, the track's exciting, all comes together. It doesn't matter what we're going through as individuals, on the bullshit level. When it gets to the music, when you can see that it's really cool, we all put in 1,000%.
It was quite obvious that the Beatles became, the thing that it started out being, it gave us a vehicle to be able to do so much when we were younger, and we grew right through that. But it got to a point where it was stifling us. There was too much restriction. It had to self-destruct.
It's easy after the fact, people are always saying about Apple and the Beatles business. Why didn't you? You sit in there with millions of dollars floating around and try and work it out. It's so easy after the fact to say, why didn't you?
It's always a possibility, though, we could have carried on. We weren't sitting in the studio saying, okay, this is it. Last record, last track, last take.
Just tell me something about Abbey Road for 1 second. I had heard that Abbey Road was not supposed to be called Abbey Road. You were going to call it something like Mount Everest or something.
Yeah.
This is true?
That is true, yeah.
What is the story there?
Well, you're making an album, and towards the end of the album, you start thinking, well, we need a title for this. So you're looking around, you're fishing around. And the engineer, Jeff Emmerich, who is our Beatle engineer who did all the great sounds for us, was smoking cigarettes called Everest. They're like a kind of menthol cigarette at the time. And we kind of looked at that and said, Everest.
It's a good name.
Kind of, it's big, it's heroic. That could be good for the album. And just one day we were in Abbey Road working, and I just sort of said, well, look, why not Abbey Road? Because if we did that, we could just run outside.
Right.
There's a level crossing, as we call it out there, zebra crossing. And we could just stand there, we could get photographed, come back to work. It'd take 2 seconds.
Right.
I said, and it's not a bad title, Abbey Road. To us, it was kind of just the name of a studio. But I thought if you take it out of context, it kind of sounds like Monastery Lane. Abbey Road. It's got a certain...
weird? Isn't it weird how just a simple thought like that becomes a legend? I mean, that's like iconic now, Abbey Road.
Yeah.
And yet it could have been called Everest. And that would have required the Beatles to fly to Mount Everest and do a whole photo shoot. So in a way, it was sort of a lazy approach.
It was a cheap approach.
Shortly thereafter, EMI Studios, which is located on Abbey Road, would be forever christened Abbey Road Studios. With the album name decided on, cover art needed to be worked out, and, in this case, simplicity was key. It was getting quite late, and you always have to get the cover in ahead of the sound. So we got hold of the photographer, Ian McMillan, gave him half an hour, and walked across the crossing. It was a very hot day in August, and I had arrived wearing a suit and sandals. It was so hot that I kicked the sandals off and walked across barefoot for a few takes. And it happened that in the shot he used that I had no shoes on, Sandy Shaw style. There's many a person who has gone barefoot, so it didn't seem any big deal for me at all. This photo shoot took place at 10 a.m. on August 8th, 1969, with the policeman holding up traffic for the 10 minutes it took for the photographer to climb a ladder in the street and take 6 shots for consideration for the album cover. It took them a while to get their legs positioned in a natural way without looking awkward, Paul then studying the prints with a magnifying glass to determine which one was best. A little later in the afternoon on that same day, after George and roadie Mal Evans returned from a trip to the zoo, they all reconvened at EMI Studio 2 to perform overdubs on The End, I Want You She's So Heavy, and Oh Darling. The effort taken for this album cover was indeed much simpler than flying to Mount Everest, as was seriously considered. In addition to the iconic image of the 4 Beatles walking across the street on what is arguably the most popular album cover in history, there are other people as well, such as an American tourist by the name of Paul Cole. Standing on the sidewalk, visible just behind John's head, Paul Cole was conversing with a policeman in his vehicle when he spotted 4 kooks, as he called them, walking across the street. Paul Cole chose to stay outside, instead of accompanying his wife on the next stop of a tour of London that they were on. Several months later, when his wife, a church organist, purchased a copy of Abbey Road to learn a song that was requested for a wedding, he then recognized the event that he witnessed in London on the front cover of the album, and then spotted himself there. This occurrence has later been dubbed the greatest photobomb ever. Note, some reports say that this mystery man is actually Tony Staples, a nearby resident. You be the judge. 3 additional people made it into the iconic Abbey Road cover, these being later identified as Alan Frannigan, Steve Millwood, and Derek Seagrove. These 3 individuals can be spotted on the left sidewalk, just above Paul's head in the photo. These 3 decorators were in the process of performing a decorating job at EMI Studios on this day, and were apparently returning from a lunch break when the picture was taken. I am the guy on the right, in the bottom left-hand corner of the picture, relates Derek Seagrove. He continues, "It wasn't unusual for me to be at Abbey Road Studios. I had been there on numerous occasions. I used to see the Beatles having a cup of tea in the canteen. We would sometimes be at the next table and say a casual hello to them. On this day, we saw them all walking out the front door at around 10 or so, which was unusual in itself. You rarely saw them at that time of day. Curiosity got the better of us, so we followed them. We stopped at the gate and they walked up the other end. We just stood there watching. The guy who was taking the photograph, Ian McMillan, was waving us to get out of the way, but we decided just to stand our ground. We had no idea about the significance of the picture. The album was released in Britain on September 26, 1969, and in America on October 1st, 1969. Somehow, unauthorized tape copies of the album were being circulated to some American radio stations, prompting Capitol Records to send out 4,000 early copies of the album to key U.S. radio stations to level the playing field, each copy accompanied by a letter asking the stations to please not air any portion of the album until the scheduled release date of October 1st, so that record outlets wouldn't be bombarded with requests for an album they didn't have in stock yet. Such was the anticipation for a new Beatles album at the time. As would be expected, it only took 3 weeks for the album to reach the #1 position on the Billboard album chart, staying there for 8 straight weeks. Then began the battle for the top spot, with the equally popular Led Zeppelin II album, which replaced Abbey Road for a week. Then Abbey Road was number 1 for 2 more weeks, only to be replaced again by Led Zeppelin 2 for another week. Abbey Road surpassed Led Zeppelin one more time for an additional week, until it succumbed yet again to the heavy rock band, the Beatles staying in the number 2 spot for the next 5 weeks. All in all, Abbey Road was at number 1 for 11 weeks, number 2 for 7 weeks, and spent a total of 27 weeks in the top 10 and 129 weeks on the charts. Abbey Road sold over 4 million copies in the first 2 months of release, this possibly being spurred on by conspiracy theorists who claimed that clues found on the album cover indicated Paul's death. In June of 1970, their manager Alan Klein reported that it was the biggest-selling album in their history, having sold 5 million copies by that point. By 2011, it had sold more than 31 million copies worldwide, becoming one of the biggest-selling Beatles albums of all time. And unbeknownst to everyone, on September 20th, 1969, 11 days before Abbey Road was released in America, John informed the rest of the group that he was leaving. And the rest, as they say, is history.